They say family is everything. They say blood is thicker than water. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones who bleed you dry. I stood in my mother's dining room, my cheek still stinging from where my 7-year-old nephew had slapped me hard. The room fell silent. I waited for someone to say something. Anything. Instead, my mother laughed. "Oh, sweetheart, he's only playing..." My sister leaned back in her chair with that smug smile I'd seen my entire life. "Go on," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Hit him back if you dare." "Oh, wait, you never dare, do you, sister?" I smiled. I actually smiled. "It's all right," I said softly. What they didn't know was that for 2 years, I'd been the one secretly paying for that little boy's $12,000 a semester private school tuition. What they didn't know was that in my purse was the payment envelope I'd brought to drop off that night. And what they definitely didn't know was that before I went to bed, I would make one simple click on my laptop that would change everything. By morning, one letter from the school would expose a truth that would shatter their perfect little delusion. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happened when my family finally realised who'd been holding them up all these years, and what happens when that person finally lets go. My name is Rebecca Torres. I'm 33 years old and I teach 5th grade at Riverside Elementary. For as long as I can remember, I've been the dependable one, the daughter who never caused trouble, the sister who always helped out, the aunt who showed up with a smile no matter what. But that Sunday evening, as I pulled into my mother's driveway with a batch of fresh-baked chocolate chip cookies on the passenger seat, I had no idea that everything I'd quietly endured for decades was about to reach its breaking point. The moment I walked through the front door, I could smell Mum's pot roast and hear the familiar sound of the television blaring in the living room. "Rebecca's here!" my mother called out cheerfully, as if my arrival was the highlight of her week. I knew better. Angela, my older sister, was already seated at the dining table, scrolling through her phone with that bored expression she always wore when I was around. Her son Ethan was running circles around the room, his energy unchecked and his voice loud enough to rattle the windows. I set the cookie box on the table and smiled. "I made these this morning," I said, Ethan's favourite. Before I could even finish the sentence, Ethan lunged forward and grabbed the box with both hands, nearly knocking it out of my grip. Cookies spilled onto the table. I gently steadied the box and looked down at him. "Ethan, sweetie," I said softly, "what do we say when someone gives us something?" He stared up at me with those big, brown eyes that should have been filled with innocence, and said nothing. Angela didn't even look up from her phone. My mother, arranging plates at the other end of the table, chuckled like it was all just adorable. "Ethan..." I tried again, a little more firmly this time. "We say, thank you, remember." That's when it happened. His hand came up faster than I expected, and he slapped me across the cheek. Hard. The crack of his palm against my skin echoed in the dining room. My head jerked to the side. For a moment, I stood there frozen, my face burning, my ears ringing. I could feel the sting spreading across my cheekbone. The room went silent. I turned slowly to look at my mother, waiting for her to say something. Anything. Surely she would correct him. Surely she would tell him that was unacceptable. Instead, she laughed. "Oh, Rebecca," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "He's only playing. Don't be so sensitive." I blinked. My chest tightened. I looked at Angela, hoping, praying that she might step in, that she might parent her child for once. But Angela just leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "Go on," she said, her voice dripping with mockery. "Hit him back, if you dare." She paused, her eyes glittering with something cold and cruel. "Oh, wait, you never dare, do you?" The words hit harder than Ethan's hand ever could. I stood there, my cheek still throbbing, staring at the two women who were supposed to love me. My mother went back to setting the table as if nothing had happened. Angela returned to her phone. Ethan grabbed another cookie and ran off laughing. I reached into my purse and felt the familiar weight of the envelope I'd brought with me tonight, the one containing the $12,500 check for Ethan's full semester tuition at Centennial Academy. The tuition they thought Angela was paying. The tuition I'd been covering in secret for 2 years. I looked at my sister. I looked at my mother. I looked at the little boy who'd just struck me without consequence. And then I smiled. "It's all right," I said quietly, my voice as cold as winter glass. "It's perfectly all right." But as I turned to leave the dining room, my hand tightened around that envelope. Because for the first time in my life, I realized something. It wasn't all right, and I was done pretending it was. I made it to my car before the tears came. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I sat there in my mother's driveway, the engine running, the envelope still clutched in my hand, and I let myself break. The sobs came from somewhere deep inside me, somewhere I'd kept locked away for so long I'd almost forgotten it existed. My cheek still burned where Ethan had hit me, but that wasn't why I was crying. I was crying because of the laughter, because of the smirk on Angela's face, because of the way my mother had waved it all away, like I was being dramatic for expecting basic respect. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and pulled out of the driveway. The streets were quiet, the Sunday evening traffic light. I drove on autopilot, my mind replaying the scene over and over. Ethan's hand, the slap, the silence, the laughter. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. How did I get here? How did I become the person everyone felt comfortable disrespecting? The answer I realized was that I'd trained them to. For as long as I could remember, I'd been the one who gave, the one who sacrificed, the one who showed up with a smile and said, "It's all right," even when it wasn't. I thought that's what love looked like. I thought that's what family meant. But sitting there in my car, my face wet with tears, I finally understood the truth. I hadn't been loving them, I'd been enabling them, and in doing so, I taught them that I didn't matter. The memories came flooding back as I drove, each one sharper and more painful than the last. 10 years ago, I was 23 and finishing my bachelor's degree in education. I'd been accepted into a prestigious master's program at the State University, full scholarship, everything paid for. It was my dream. I was going to become a reading specialist, work with kids who struggled, make a real difference. I'd worked so hard for it. My father had been so proud. He told me just weeks before he died that I was going to do amazing things. Then Mum had her accident. She'd been driving home from the grocery store when someone ran a red light and T-boned her car. Broken ribs, collapsed, lung 3 surgeries. The hospital bills piled up fast. Her insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. She was looking at bankruptcy. I remember sitting in that sterile waiting room listening to her cry about losing the house, losing everything Dad had worked for. Angela had been there too. She'd patted Mum's hand and said all the right things, but when the social worker came in to discuss payment options, Angela suddenly remembered she had somewhere to be. Just like that, she was gone. And I was left sitting there, holding Mum's hand, watching her fall apart. I withdrew from the master's program the next day. I cashed out the small trust fund Dad had left me, the one he'd set aside for my education. $28,000. It was supposed to be my future. Instead, it became Mom's lifeline. I paid her hospital bills, covered her mortgage for 6 months, while she recovered, made sure she had everything she needed. When it was over, when Mum was back on her feet and the bills were paid, I expected her to thank me. Maybe even acknowledge what I'd given up. But she didn't. Instead, at a family dinner much like tonight's, she'd smiled at Angela and said, "I'm so lucky to have such wonderful daughters. Angela's been such a comfort to me during this difficult time." I'd sat there fork frozen halfway to my mouth, waiting for her to mention me. She never did. 5 years ago, Angela had come to me with bright eyes and big plans. She was going to open a nail salon. She had the perfect location, the perfect name, everything mapped out. She just needed $20,000 to get started. "It's an investment, Becca," she'd said, using the nickname only she called me the one that used to make me feel special. "I'll pay you back with interest. 6 months tops." I'd been teaching for 5 years by then. I'd saved, carefully lived in a small apartment, driven the same beat-up Honda Civic since college. That $20,000 was everything I had. But Angela was my sister, and she'd looked at me with such hope, such certainty that I wanted to believe her. I gave her the money. The nail salon never materialized. According to mutual friends, Angela and her then-boyfriend had taken a 3-week trip to Cancun instead. When I finally confronted her about it, she'd shrugged and said, "The business didn't work out. These things happen. You know I'm good for it." That was 5 years ago. I'd never seen a single dollar of it back. And then, 2 years ago when Ethan was starting kindergarten, Angela had been in my living room crying. The public schools in her district were terrible. Ethan deserved better. Centennial Academy was the best private school in the area, but the tuition was impossible. She was a single mother, working part-time, barely making rent. What was she supposed to do? I'd listened to her sob, watched her mascara run down her face, and felt that familiar tug in my chest. Ethan was innocent in all this. He was just a little boy who deserved a good education. It wasn't his fault his mother was irresponsible with money. So I'd called the school. I'd set up an anonymous donor account. Every quarter, $12,500 would automatically withdraw from my checking account and go directly to Ethan's tuition. The school sent acknowledgement letters to Angela thanking Mrs. Angela Torres for her timely payments. I never corrected them. I let Angela take the credit. I let her bask in the glory of being the mother who sacrificed for her son's education, who somehow managed to afford the best school in town. And she let me. She never questioned how the payments were being made. She never wondered where the money came from. She just accepted it as her due the way she'd accepted everything else I'd ever given her. Now pulling into my apartment complex, I felt something shift inside me. That envelope was still on my passenger seat. I picked it up, held it in both hands, and stared at it. Inside my apartment, I didn't bother turning on the lights. I went straight to my bedroom, opened my laptop, and waited for it to boot up. My hands were steadier now. My tears had dried. I navigated to the Centennial Academy payment portal and logged into my donor account. There it was. Recurring donation, $12,500 quarterly. Next payment due September 15th. I scrolled down to the account settings. My finger hovered over the button that read, "Cancel recurring donation." One click. That's all it would take. I stared at that button for what felt like an eternity, my finger trembling above the trackpad. The blue glow of the laptop screen illuminated my dark bedroom, casting shadows on the walls. Part of me wanted to close the computer, pretend I'd never thought of this, go back to being the Rebecca everyone expected me to be. The Rebecca who smiled and said, "It's all right," no matter how badly she was treated. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I scrolled up to read the terms and conditions one more time, needing to be absolutely certain. There it was, in plain black text. This donation is voluntary and renewable at the donor's discretion. There is no contractual obligation to continue funding beyond the current paid period. Donors may cancel at any time with immediate effect. Any prepaid amounts for future terms will be refunded within 5-7 business days. Voluntary, no obligation. I could stop this any time I wanted. I'd set this up so carefully 2 years ago, making sure I wasn't locked into anything legally binding. At the time, I told myself it was just smart planning, that I was being responsible by keeping my options open. But deep down, I think I'd always known this moment might come. The moment when I'd have to choose between continuing to sacrifice myself or finally drawing a line. I stood up from my desk and walked to the bathroom, flipping on the light. The brightness made me squint. I leaned close to the mirror and turned my face to the left. There it was. A faint bruise was already forming on my cheekbone, a shadow of purple blooming beneath my skin where Ethan's hand had connected. I touched it gently and winced. It wasn't the physical pain that bothered me. I'd had worse. A few years ago, I'd taken a softball to the face during recess duty and ended up with a black eye that lasted 2 weeks. No, what bothered me was what the bruise represented. It was evidence of a little boy who'd learned that hitting people had no consequences. Evidence of a mother who'd rather check her phone than teach her son basic decency. Evidence of a grandmother who found cruelty amusing, as long as it wasn't directed at her favourite daughter. I stared at my reflection, really looked at myself for the first time in a long time. When had I become this person? When had I started accepting crumbs of affection and calling it love? My father's face flashed through my mind the way he'd looked at me the last time I saw him in the hospital. He'd squeezed my hand and told me I had a good heart. But Becky, he'd whispered, his voice weak, don't let people mistake your kindness for weakness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face the consequences of their own choices. I'd been 23 then, too young to fully understand what he meant, but standing here now, looking at the bruise on my face, I finally got it. I walked back to my bedroom and sat down at my laptop. The screen had dimmed but was still on the cursor, still blinking next to that button. I took a deep breath and clicked it. A confirmation dialog box appeared. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring donation? This action cannot be undone. My hand didn't shake this time. I clicked, yes, cancel donation. The screen refreshed. A new message appeared. Your recurring donation has been successfully cancelled. A refund of $12,500 for the upcoming quarter will be processed to your original payment method within 5-7 business days. Thank you for your generosity to Centennial Academy. I sat back in my chair and waited for the guilt to hit me, for the panic, for the voice in my head that would tell me I was being selfish and cruel. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Lighter. Like I'd been carrying a weight I didn't even know was there until I set it down. But I wasn't done yet. I navigated to a different website one I'd bookmarked months ago but never acted on. The Children's Hope Foundation. A scholarship fund for kids in foster care and orphanages. Children who had no family support, no safety net, no one to pay their tuition or buy them school supplies. I'd been donating $50 a month to them for the past year, whatever I could spare after paying for Ethan's school. Now I could do more. I clicked on the donation page and set up a new recurring contribution. $12,500 per quarter, the same amount I'd been giving to Ethan. The confirmation screen showed my first donation would process as soon as the refund from Centennial Academy hit my account. I thought about those kids, the ones who had nothing, who'd been abandoned or removed from dangerous homes, kids who'd never had anyone show up for them. My money could send several of them to good schools, buy them books and uniforms, give them a chance at a future they'd otherwise never have. Kids who would appreciate it, kids who needed it. Ethan needed something too, but it wasn't my money. He needed a mother who would teach him accountability. He needed a grandmother who would correct him instead of laugh at him. He needed to learn while he was still young enough to change that the world didn't revolve around him. And sometimes the most loving thing an aunt could do was step back and let that lesson land. I closed my laptop and climbed into bed. For the first time in months, I fell asleep easily. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange sort of peace. I went to work, taught my students graded papers, lived my life. I didn't hear from Angela or my mother, but that wasn't unusual. They only called when they needed something. I found myself checking my email more than normal, wondering when the school would send Angela the notification, wondering when she'd realised the money had stopped. Then, on a Wednesday evening exactly 14 days after I'd clicked that button, I was making dinner when my phone buzzed. A text from Angela. Just 2 words, call me, now. I stared at the message, my heart beating faster. I didn't call. Instead, I opened my laptop and checked my personal email, the one I rarely used. There in my spam folder, where automated notifications often landed, was a message from Centennial Academy dated that morning. The subject line read, Payment Past Due Notice. I clicked it open and began to read. I clicked the email open and read it slowly, savouring every word. Dear Mrs. Angela Torres, this is a courtesy reminder that we have not yet received the tuition payment of $12,500 for the full semester. Our records indicate that this payment was scheduled to process automatically on September 15th, but was not completed. We understand that occasional payment delays occur and want to work with you to resolve this matter. You have a 30-day grace period from the original due date to submit payment without penalty. If you have any questions about your account or need to discuss payment arrangements, please contact our billing office at your earliest convenience. We value Ethan as a member of our Centennial Academy family and look forward to continuing his educational journey with us. Sincerely, Margaret Whitmore, Director of Financial Services, Centennial Academy. It was professional, polite, completely routine. And I knew reading those carefully worded sentences that Angela was probably losing her mind right about now. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter and went back to chopping vegetables for my stir-fry. My hands were steady. My mind was clear. I felt calm in a way I hadn't felt in years, like I'd finally stepped off a treadmill I didn't even realise I'd been running on. Whatever was about to happen, whatever storm was brewing, I was ready for it. My phone started ringing. Angela. I glanced at the screen and let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again, and again. By the time I'd finished cooking and sat down to eat, she'd called 7 times. I ate my dinner slowly, tasting every bite, and didn't pick up once. I could imagine the scene playing out across town. Angela staring at that email, reading it over and over, her perfect mask of competence cracking. She'd told everyone, absolutely everyone, that she was handling Ethan's education, that she was the devoted single mother who somehow managed to afford the best private school in the area. She'd probably even embellished it, made it sound like she was making huge sacrifices, working extra hours, going without, so her son could have opportunities. And now the school was asking her for $12,500 she didn't have and had never planned to pay. I imagined her scrambling to check her bank accounts, looking for some automatic payment she'd forgotten about, some explanation that would make sense, and finding nothing. Because there was nothing to find. She'd never set up any payments. She'd never had to. I'd done it all for her. Around 8:30, my phone rang again. This time, it was my mother. I let that one go to voicemail too. Then, a text from Angela in all caps. Pick up your phone right now. I deleted it without responding. What I didn't know then, but learnt later from a mutual friend who loved gossip, was exactly how that evening had unfolded at my mother's house. According to Sarah, who heard it from her sister, who lived next door to my mother, Angela had shown up at Mum's house in a complete panic, around 6 o'clock, still in her work uniform from the dental office, where she'd recently started as a receptionist. She'd burst through the door, waving her phone, practically hysterical. Mom, did you set up Ethan's tuition payments? Please tell me you did. My mother had been watching her evening game shows and was annoyed at the interruption. What are you talking about? Why would I set up his payments? That's your responsibility. But I never set them up. I never did, Mum. I thought you were handling it. That's when my mother apparently got very quiet. Angela, are you telling me you've been letting that boy go to that expensive school for 2 years and you never actually paid for it? Someone's been paying. The school never asked me for money until today. Look at this email. My mother had put on her reading glasses and squinted at Angela's phone. They'd both sat there in confused silence for several minutes before my mother said the words that changed everything. Call the school, right now. Find out who's been paying. Angela had called the billing office, but it was after hours. She'd left a frantic voicemail. They'd spent the rest of the evening speculating, arguing, panicking. Angela insisted it must have been some kind of scholarship she'd applied for and forgotten about. My mother suggested maybe it was a clerical error, and the school had been billing the wrong family. Neither of them considered me, not even for a second. It simply didn't occur to them that I would be capable of something like this, that I would have the resources or the inclination to pay for Ethan's schooling in secret. The next morning, Angela had called the billing office the minute they opened. I knew this because she called me immediately afterward, and this time I answered. "Rebecca." Her voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. "I just got off the phone with Centennial Academy." "Good morning to you too, Angela," I said pleasantly. I was getting ready for work, standing in front of my bathroom mirror, applying mascara. Don't you dare act innocent. The secretary told me everything. She told me that you've been listed as the financial sponsor for Ethan's account since 2023. You, not me. You've been paying his tuition this whole time, and you let me think it was taken care of. "You're welcome," I said softly. There was a beat of stunned silence. "What did you just say?" I said, "You're all welcome. For 2 years of private school tuition. That's $50,000, Angela. You're welcome." "You had no right. You made me look like an idiot. The school thought I was paying. Everyone thought I was handling it, and now they know I'm a liar." "You are a liar," I said, calmly putting down my mascara wand. "You've been lying for 2 years. You've been taking credit for something you never did. I just stopped enabling that lie." "That bitch set us up," I heard her say, though not to me. She must have turned away from the phone, probably talking to my mother. Then she was back, her voice venomous. "You did this on purpose. You cancelled his tuition to humiliate me." "I cancelled a donation I was making voluntarily. There's a difference." "I'm coming over there right now. We're going to settle this face to face." She hung up before I could respond. I finished getting ready for work, made myself a cup of tea, and sat down at my kitchen table. 20 minutes later, I heard tires screeching outside my apartment building, then rapid footsteps on the stairs, then pounding on my door. "Open up!" Angela's voice was raw with fury. "I know you're in there. Open this door right now. I know you did this on purpose." I took a slow sip of my tea and didn't move. The pounding continued. "Rebecca, I swear to God, if you don't open this door right now." Angela's fist hit the wood so hard I thought she might actually break through. I could hear my neighbour's door crack open down the hall, someone peeking out to see what the commotion was about. Let them look. Let them hear. I had nothing to hide anymore. I sat at my kitchen table for a full 20 minutes finishing my tea, while Angela alternated between banging on the door and yelling threats through it. Her voice grew hoarse. The intervals between her outbursts grew longer. I imagined her out there in the hallway, probably in those expensive designer jeans. She always wore, the ones she'd bought with money she claimed she didn't have, leaning against the wall and trying to catch her breath. Finally, when the silence had stretched for a solid 3 minutes, I stood up. I walked to the door slowly, deliberately. I smoothed down my blouse, tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, and put on my most pleasant smile. Then, I opened the door. Angela looked awful. Her mascara had run, leaving black streaks down her flushed cheeks. Her hair, usually so carefully styled, was a mess. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving. When she saw me standing there calm and collected, something in her expression shifted from rage to confusion, and then back to rage again. "Well," I said pleasantly, as if she were a friend who'd stopped by for coffee. "Good morning, Angela. Would you like to come in?" She shoved past me without waiting for the invitation, storming into my small living room. I closed the door quietly behind her and followed at a leisurely pace. She whirled around to face me, her finger pointed at my chest like a weapon. "You cancelled his tuition." The words came out in a strangled shout. "You deliberately sabotaged my son's education." I walked past her to the kitchen, picking up my empty teacup. "Would you like some tea? I just made a fresh pot. It's chamomile. Very soothing." "Don't you dare patronise me. Answer the question." I turned to face her, leaning against my kitchen counter. "I didn't cancel his tuition, Angela. I stopped donating to it. There's a difference." "That's the same thing." "No, it's really not. Tuition is something a parent pays for their child's education. What I was doing was making a voluntary charitable donation. I chose to stop. That's my right. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. You promised you'd help? You promised you'd take care of it. I tilted my head, genuinely curious. Did I? That's interesting. Show me where I signed that promise. Show me the document, the contract, the email, where I committed to paying for Ethan's education indefinitely. She opened her mouth and then closed it. Her face went through several shades of red. You know there's no contract, but you said you'd help with him. You've always helped. I did help, for 2 years, $50,000 worth of help to be exact. But help doesn't mean forever, Angela. Help doesn't mean I surrender my entire financial future to subsidize yours. This isn't about money. This is about Ethan. He's your nephew. Don't you care about him at all? The question hit something deep inside me, but I kept my voice level. Of course I care about him. That's exactly why I'm doing this. How is destroying his education caring about him? I set down my teacup and looked at her directly. I'm not destroying his education. You're the one who enrolled him in a school you couldn't afford. You're the one who never bothered to check where the money was coming from. You're the one who's been lying to everyone, including yourself, about being able to provide for your son. That's not fair. I'm doing my best. Being a single mother is hard. So is being the person everyone expects to fix their problems. So is working full-time, living in a tiny apartment, driving a 15-year-old car and never taking a vacation because every spare dollar goes to other people's emergencies. But you wouldn't know anything about that, would you? She stared at me like I'd slapped her. What's that supposed to mean? It means that last year, while I was paying Ethan's tuition, you took him to Disney World. It means you drive a car that's only 3 years old, while mine is old enough to get a learner's permit. It means you get your nails done every 2 weeks and your hair highlighted every month and you wear clothes with designer labels. And somehow you expect me to believe you're struggling. Those things aren't expensive and I deserve to have nice things sometimes. You're absolutely right. You do deserve nice things. But you don't deserve to have them paid for by someone you treat like garbage. The air went out of her. I don't treat you like garbage. Really, should we talk about Sunday dinner? Should we talk about the fact that your 7-year-old son slapped me across the face and you laughed? Should we talk about how you taunted me in front of him, teaching him that disrespecting me is not only acceptable, but entertaining? He's just a kid. He was playing around. No, Angela, he wasn't. And deep down, you know that. But you didn't correct him because you don't respect me either. None of you do. And you don't respect me because I've never demanded respect. I've been so busy being helpful, being generous, being the good daughter and the good sister and the good aunt that I forgot to be a person with boundaries. She was crying now, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of frustration, of someone who'd been caught and didn't know how to talk their way out of it. So what, you're just going to abandon us? Abandon Ethan? I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm still your sister. I'm still his aunt. I'm still here. I'm just not going to be your ATM anymore. The words hung in the air between us. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open like she couldn't quite process what I'd just said. This was the Rebecca she'd never met before. The one who said no. The one who drew lines. The one who valued herself enough to walk away. You're unbelievable, she finally said, her voice shaking. Wait until Mum hears about this. Wait until she finds out what you've done. She turned and headed for the door, grabbing her purse from where she'd dropped it on the floor. I followed her slowly, my hands in my pockets. She yanked the door open and then stopped, turning back to deliver what she clearly thought would be a devastating final blow. Mum will hear about this, and when she does, you'll be sorry. She's going to be so disappointed in you. I smiled, then a small sad smile that I felt all the way down to my bones. She already knows, Angela. That stopped her. What? She already knows? The school sent the notice yesterday. You called her immediately, remember? You both know the truth now. You've known for almost 24 hours. And in all that time, in all those phone calls you made to me, all that pounding on my door, not once did Mum pick up the phone to call me herself. Not once did she ask to hear my side of the story. She just let you come here to yell at me and try to bully me back into compliance. Angela's face went pale. So yes, I continued softly, she'll hear about this. She'll hear your version where I'm the villain, and she'll probably believe it because that's easier than admitting the truth. What truth? That she just doesn't want to admit who's been holding this family together all these years. And what happens when that person finally lets go? Angela left without another word, the door slamming behind her, so hard that a picture frame rattled on my wall. I stood there in the sudden silence, my heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I'd done it. I'd actually stood up to her. For the first time in my entire life, I'd looked my sister in the eye and refused to back down. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt exhausted. The next few days passed in an uneasy quiet. No calls, no texts, no dramatic confrontations. I went to work, came home, graded papers, lived my life. Part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, they were actually thinking about what I'd said. Maybe they were reflecting on their behaviour. Maybe some small seed of accountability had been planted. I should have known better. 5 days after Angela's visit, my phone rang at 7:30 in the evening. I was curled up on my couch with a book, a glass of wine on the side table, finally starting to relax into this new version of my life. When I saw my mother's name on the screen, my stomach clenched. I considered letting it go to voicemail, like I had with Angela's calls, but something made me answer. "Hello, Mum." Rebecca Marie Torres. Her voice was ice cold, using my full name the way she had when I was a child and in trouble. "I raised you better than this." No greeting, no "how are you," just straight to condemnation. I took a sip of my wine before responding. "Better than what exactly?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about. What you're doing to your sister, to your nephew, cutting off a child's education out of spite. I never thought you could be so cruel." So, I closed my book and set it aside. "I'm not being cruel, Mum. I'm being honest. For the first time in a very long time, I'm being honest about what I can and cannot continue to do." Cannot? Oh, please, you're a teacher with no husband, no children, no responsibilities. You have plenty of money. You're just choosing to be selfish. The word stung more than I wanted to admit. Is that really what you think? That because I don't have a family of my own, my money and my time and my energy belong to everyone else? That's what family does, Rebecca. We help each other. We sacrifice for each other. Funny, I said, my voice steady despite the anger building in my chest. I don't remember you sacrificing for me. I don't remember Angela sacrificing for me. When was the last time either of you asked what I needed? When was the last time you showed up for me the way I've shown up for you? That's different. Angela has a child to raise. I'm getting older. I need support. You're young and capable. I was young and capable 10 years ago when I gave up graduate school to pay your hospital bills. I was young and capable 5 years ago when I loaned Angela $20,000 I never got back. I've been young and capable my entire adult life, and you know what? That's gotten me. A savings account that should have $100,000 in it but has $12,000. A career that should be further along but isn't because I never got that master's degree. And a family that thinks I exist solely to solve their problems. There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Mum spoke again, her voice had shifted, becoming sharper. I knew this would happen eventually. I knew you'd throw all of that in our faces someday. I'm not throwing anything in your face. I'm just stating facts. No, Rebecca, you're being vindictive. You've always been jealous of your sister, and now you've found a way to hurt her. The accusation hit me like a physical blow. Jealous. You think I'm jealous of Angela? Of course you are. You always have been. She's beautiful. She's charming. She has a son. And what do you have? A tiny apartment and a job teaching other people's children. It must eat you alive that she has everything you want. I stood up from the couch, my hand gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Mom, Angela, is a 35-year-old woman who can't hold down a job, who lies about her finances, who's raising a child with no sense of respect or boundaries. If you think that's something to be jealous of, then you and I have very different definitions of success. Don't you dare speak about your sister that way. She's doing her best in difficult circumstances. And what about me? What about the difficult circumstances I've faced? Or do mine not count because I handled them without making them everyone else's problem? That's enough, Rebecca. I didn't raise you to be disrespectful. No, you didn't. You raised me to give everything and expect nothing in return. You raised me to be convenient, to be useful, to be the backup plan when your favourite daughter's life falls apart. You raised me to believe that my worth was measured by how much I could sacrifice for other people. How dare you? Her voice was shaking now, whether with anger or something else I couldn't tell. Everything I did for both of my daughters equally. That's a lie, and you know it. You've chosen Angela over me at every single turn since we were children. When I got good grades, you said I was showing off. When she barely graduated high school, you threw her a party. When I got into college, you asked if I really needed to go. When she dropped out after one semester, you said she was finding herself. And last week, when her son slapped me across the face, you laughed. Silence. You laughed, Mom. Your grandson hit me hard enough to leave a bruise, and you laughed and told me he was playing. Do you have any idea what that felt like? You're being dramatic. It was barely a tap. It wasn't a tap. And even if it was the fact that you saw nothing wrong with it, that Angela saw nothing wrong with this, tells me everything I need to know about where I stand in this family. If you feel so unappreciated, maybe you should take a look at your own attitude. Maybe if you weren't so rigid, so judgmental, people would treat you better. Or what, Mum? The words came out before I could stop them. Or what will you do? Will you slap me too? Would that teach me to be less rigid? Another silence longer this time. When she spoke again, her voice was cold and final. I think we're done with this conversation. You need to fix this situation with Ethan's school. You need to apologise to your sister. And you need to remember what family means. If you don't do those things, if you insist on continuing down this selfish path, then don't bother coming to family dinners anymore. Don't bother calling. Don't bother showing up for holidays. If you're going to act like you're not part of this family, then you won't be treated like part of this family. It was an ultimatum, a threat, the same kind of manipulation she'd used on me my entire life. Comply or be cast out. Sacrifice or be abandoned. For 33 years that threat had worked. For 33 years the fear of losing my family had kept me in line. But standing there in my living room, phone pressed to my ear, I realised something. I'd already lost them, or maybe I'd never really had them at all. 5 seconds passed. 5 seconds where my mother waited for me to cave to apologise, to promise I'd fix everything like I always did. Instead, I said one word. Okay. Then I hung up the phone. I stood there with the phone still in my hand, staring at the blank screen. My mother's ultimatum echoed in my ears, but instead of the panic I'd expected to feel, there was only a strange sense of lightness. I'd just been essentially disowned by my own mother, cut off from family dinners and holidays, and yet I felt more free than I had in decades. It was terrifying and liberating all at once. I didn't cry. I didn't call back. I didn't second-guess myself. I simply poured another glass of wine, picked up my book, and returned to my reading. Whatever happened next, I'd face it with my eyes open and my boundaries intact. The following week brought an unseasonably cold snap to our town, the kind of weather that makes you want to stay curled up under blankets. I threw myself into work, spending extra hours in my classroom preparing for the upcoming parent-teacher conferences. My fifth graders were working on a unit about family trees, talking excitedly about their relatives and heritage. I smiled and nodded and helped them draw their branches, all while avoiding thoughts of my own broken family tree. On Thursday afternoon, I was at the grocery store when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Rebecca, it's Jennifer. Jennifer Hoffman, Angela's friend from book club." I stopped in the middle of the cereal aisle. Jennifer and Angela had been close for years, part of the same social circle of mothers who met every other Tuesday to drink wine and pretend they'd read the selected novel. I'd met her a handful of times at family gatherings. "Hi, Jennifer. Is everything okay?" There was a pause, and I could hear her take a breath like she was steeling herself. "I need to tell you something, and it's probably going to sound like I'm betraying Angela, but honestly, I think she's been lying to all of us for a really long time, and I just can't be part of it anymore." My hand tightened on my shopping cart. "What do you mean?" "The tuition thing. With Ethan's school. She's been telling everyone who'll listen that you deliberately sabotaged her son's education, that you promised to help and then pulled the rug out from under her to be spiteful. She's making you out to be this terrible person." Jennifer paused. "But Karen's daughter works in the office at Centennial Academy. She told Karen what really happened, that you've been paying anonymously for 2 years, that Angela never even knew, that you were the one funding everything and Angela was taking all the credit." I closed my eyes, leaning against my cart for support. "I see. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. When Karen told us, a bunch of stuff started making sense. Like how Angela's always complaining about money but somehow affords designer purses. Or how she said she couldn't loan me $50 for groceries last month, but then posted pictures from that expensive brunch place downtown. And remember 5 years ago when she said she was opening a nail salon." "I remember." "She told us it fell through because of permit issues, but Sarah saw her in Cancun during that same time period, posted all over social media. Sarah showed us the pictures." Jennifer's voice dropped. "How much did she borrow from you for that salon?" $20,000. "Oh my God!" I heard genuine shock in her voice. "Rebecca, I am so sorry. We all thought she was this struggling single mum who was barely making it work, and we felt bad for her. But she's been playing all of us, using all of us, and we let her because we felt sorry for her." Tears stung my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of validation. Someone outside my family finally saw the truth. Someone believed me without me having to defend myself. "Thank you for calling," I managed to say. "You have no idea what it means to hear you say that. I should have called sooner. We all should have." Jennifer hesitated. "For what it's worth, most of the book club is on your side now. We've been talking, comparing notes. Angela owes money to at least four of us. Small amounts, 50, here 100 there, but it adds up. And she always has an excuse why she can't pay us back." After we hung up, I stood in that grocery store aisle for a full minute, just breathing. Then, I finished my shopping and drove home feeling like maybe I wasn't crazy after all. Maybe I wasn't the villain in this story. That evening, I learnt through Sarah, who texted me out of the blue, that Angela had spent the past week desperately trying to secure a loan. She'd approached everyone she knew, spinning various versions of her sob story, painting me as everything from petty to cruel to mentally unstable. But word had gotten around. The book club had talked. Jennifer had talked. People were comparing notes and asking questions Angela couldn't answer. Her friends had started refusing her requests. "I'm sorry, Angela, but I remember you borrowed money from me 2 years ago and never paid it back. Didn't you just buy a new car? If you can afford those boots, you can afford your son's tuition." She'd even gone to the bank, Sarah told me, hoping to get a personal loan or a line of credit. But Angela's credit score, destroyed by years of maxed out cards and missed payments, meant instant denial. The loan officer had apparently looked at her application and said she'd need a co-signer with excellent credit and substantial income. Angela had immediately thought of me, of course. According to Sarah, she actually laughed when she told the story to the book club, saying she'd rather let Ethan transfer to public school than grovel to me. The other mothers had shifted uncomfortably, not laughing along like they used to. On Friday afternoon, I was sitting at my desk after school updating my lesson plans for the following week when my cell phone rang. The caller ID showed Centennial Academy. My heart jumped. I answered immediately. Ms. Torres, this is Principal Harrison. Good afternoon, Principal Harrison. I kept my voice professional, though my mind was racing through possibilities. Had Angela somehow convinced them I was at fault? Had there been some mistake in the cancellation? I wanted to reach out to you directly. I am aware of the situation with Ethan Torres' tuition. He paused and I heard papers shuffling. Our records show you've been his financial sponsor for 2 years. I want you to know that we greatly appreciated your generosity and we're sorry to lose your support. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. There's something else, Ms. Torres. Something I think you should know about. His voice changed, becoming more serious. Ethan's behaviour has been concerning us for some time now. We've documented several incidents with teachers and other students. I've tried to discuss this with his mother, but our conversations haven't been productive. My stomach dropped. What kind of incidents? I'd rather show you in person if you're willing to come in. There are some reports, some video footage from our playground cameras. It's about what your nephew has been doing to other children. He paused. Given that you are his sponsor and clearly care about his welfare, I thought you should see this before we move forward with our disciplinary procedures. Disciplinary procedures. Ms. Torres, I need to show you something. Can you come in tomorrow? It's about what your nephew has been doing to other children. I arrived at Centennial Academy at 9 o'clock Saturday morning. The school was quiet, most of the students gone for the weekend, but Principal Harrison's office light was on. He met me at the front entrance, a tall man in his late 50s with kind eyes that couldn't quite hide the concern behind them. Ms. Torres, thank you for coming on a weekend. I know this is unusual. He shook my hand and led me down the familiar hallways I'd walked during the school tours 2 years ago when I'd first set up Ethan's sponsorship. Back then, I'd been so proud imagining my nephew thriving in these bright classrooms, becoming a confident, educated young man. Now I followed Principal Harrison with a sense of dread pooling in my stomach. His office was lined with bookshelves and children's artwork. He gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs across from his desk, then settled into his own seat with a manila folder in front of him. He opened it slowly like he was giving me time to prepare myself. Ms. Torres, I'm going to be direct with you because I believe you genuinely care about this child's well-being. He pulled out several sheets of paper. Over the past 18 months, we've documented 12 separate behavioural incidents involving Ethan. Most of them involve other students, specifically students from lower-income families who attend on scholarship. My heart sank. What kind of incidents? He slid the first report across the desk. I picked it up and began reading. September of last year, Ethan had told a classmate named Marcus that his shoes were poor people's shoes and that Marcus should ask his mum to get a real job. The teacher had overheard and corrected him, but according to her notes, Ethan had laughed it off and said his mum told him it was true. The next report was worse. November. Ethan had refused to partner with a girl named Sophia for a science project because, in his words, my mum says I shouldn't have to work with scholarship kids because they'll bring down my grade. I felt sick reading through them one after another. January, Ethan mocking a boy's homemade lunch. March, Ethan telling his teacher that certain kids don't belong here. May, Ethan pushing a smaller child off the swing and saying, "My family pays for this school, yours doesn't." Every time we've contacted his mother about these incidents, Principal Harrison said quietly, She's either dismissed them as misunderstandings or defended his statements. She's told us that Ethan is just being honest, that he's learning to advocate for himself, that we're being too sensitive. I set down the papers, my hands shaking. I had no idea. I didn't think you did. Your donation setup was anonymous and you've never attended parent conferences or school events. But Ms. Torres, there's something else I need to show you. He turned his computer monitor so I could see it. This is from our playground security footage from 3 weeks ago. He pressed play. The video showed the playground during recess, children running and playing. Then I saw Ethan, unmistakable in his red jacket, approach a smaller boy who was sitting alone on a bench. The boy looked up and smiled, said something I couldn't hear. Ethan's response was immediate. He reached out and slapped the child across the face. Hard. The little boy's head jerked to the side. He started crying, and Ethan stood there laughing. The exact same laugh I'd heard in my mother's dining room 5 weeks ago. I watched as a teacher rushed over, saw Ethan shrug like it was no big deal, saw him walk away, still laughing while the other child sobbed. The image froze on screen, and I couldn't look away from my nephew's face. That casual cruelty, that complete lack of remorse. He told the teacher the same thing his mother apparently told him, Principal Harrison said softly, that he was just playing, that the other boy was being too sensitive. I pressed my hand to my mouth, fighting back tears. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. I was looking at a 7-year-old boy who was already becoming his mother, already learning that other people's feelings didn't matter, already believing that money and status gave him the right to treat others as less than human. He learned this, I whispered. He learned this from watching them. I'm sorry. I looked up at Principal Harrison and suddenly everything clicked into place with horrible clarity. He learned this from watching how his mother and grandmother treat people, how they treat me. He slapped me at a family dinner 5 weeks ago and they laughed. They told him it was fine that he was just playing. They taught him that hitting people, demeaning people is acceptable behaviour. Principal Harrison leaned back in his chair, nodding slowly. That aligns with what we've observed. Children don't develop this kind of behaviour in a vacuum. They learn it from the adults around them. What happens now? I asked. What are these disciplinary procedures you mentioned? Given the pattern of behaviour and the physical violence in this latest incident, we're suspending Ethan for 2 weeks when school resumes. But, Ms. Torres, there's a bigger issue. He closed the folder. Even if his mother manages to pay the tuition for this semester, I'm not certain we can allow him to continue here without significant behavioural intervention. We have a responsibility to protect our other students. I nodded, understanding completely. You're right. He needs help. He needs consequences. He needs to learn now while he's still young enough to change. I met the principal's eyes. Keep the suspension. Make it clear to his mother why this is happening. Don't let her dismiss it or minimise it. Because if Ethan doesn't learn this lesson, now he's going to grow up to be someone who hurts people without remorse. I appreciate your support on this. I have to ask, though. He hesitated. Will you be reinstating your financial sponsorship? No. The word came out firm and clear. My nephew needs a lot of things right now, but my money isn't one of them. He needs parents who teach him empathy. He needs consequences for his actions. He needs to understand that the world doesn't revolve around him and his comfort. I stood up, gathering my purse. Thank you for showing me this. I know it wasn't easy. Ms. Torres, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. Sometimes love means stepping back and letting people face reality. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying that video over and over. That little boy crying, Ethan laughing. I thought about Marcus and Sophia and all the other children my nephew had hurt with his words and actions. I thought about the path he was on, where it would lead if nobody intervened. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a blank piece of paper in front of me. I picked up my pen and wrote 3 words at the top. Dear Ethan. Then I stopped, thinking carefully about what to say. This letter wasn't for my mother, who wouldn't listen. It wasn't for Angela, who would twist my words into weapons. This was for a 7-year-old boy who was standing at a crossroads, even if he didn't know it yet. I began writing. Dear Ethan, I need to tell you why I stopped paying for your school. It's not because I don't love you. It's not because I'm angry at you. It's because I love you enough to tell you the truth, even when that truth is hard to hear. I sat at my kitchen table for over an hour, choosing each word carefully. This letter had to be honest, but not harsh. It had to be clear, but not condescending. Most importantly, it had to reach the little boy I remembered, the one who used to hug me tight and tell me I was his favourite aunt before the world had taught him all the wrong lessons. You're 7 years old now. I continued writing, and you're learning about how to treat people. Some of what you're learning is good, but some of it isn't. I saw something happen at your school that made me very sad. I saw you hurt another child and laugh about it. I saw you say mean things to kids who didn't deserve it. And when I asked myself how you learnt to do those things, I realised something. You learned it from watching the grown-ups in your family. I paused, rereading what I'd written. Was this too much for a 7-year-old? Would he even understand? But then I thought about my students, about how much children actually comprehend when we give them credit for it. Kids know when something isn't right. They feel it even if they can't always name it. I didn't stop paying for your school to punish you, Ethan. I stopped because I realised I was helping teach you the wrong lesson. I was teaching you that you can treat people badly and still get everything you want. I was teaching you that actions don't have consequences. And if I kept doing that, I would be hurting you worse than any punishment could. My hand cramped and I flexed my fingers before continuing. Here's what I want you to know. You are not a bad kid, but you're learning to do bad things. And if nobody stops you now, you'll grow up thinking that's okay. The boy I saw in that video, the one who hit another child and laughed, that's not who you really are. That's who you're becoming because the people around you told you it was fine. I didn't stop loving you, Ethan. I stopped enabling the people who are teaching you wrong. I signed it simply, Aunt Rebecca, and folded the letter carefully. Then I placed it in an envelope and wrote on the outside, for Ethan Torres, to be given when appropriate. Sunday morning, I drove back to Centennial Academy. I'd called ahead and Principal Harrison had agreed to meet me briefly. He was in casual clothes, jeans and a polo shirt, catching up on paperwork in his office. Ms. Torres, he stood when I entered. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. I handed him the envelope. I wrote this for Ethan. I don't want you to give it to him right now while everything is still raw, and Angela is probably filling his head with stories about how terrible I am. But maybe someday, when he's ready to hear it, when he asks the right questions, you could give this to him. Principal Harrison took the envelope, turning it over in his hands. You care about him a great deal. I do. That's why I had to do this. I sank into the chair across from his desk, suddenly exhausted. I keep questioning myself, wondering if I'm being cruel, if I'm punishing a child for his mother's mistakes. May I tell you something? He sat down still, holding my letter. When I was 8 years old, I was a lot like Ethan. My father had money, and he taught me that money meant I was better than other people. I was a bully. I said horrible things to kids whose parents weren't as wealthy as mine. I thought I was entitled to everything. I looked up surprised. Then my father went to prison for embezzlement. Overnight, we had nothing. We lost our house, our car, everything. My mother moved us into a tiny apartment in the worst part of town. And suddenly, I was the poor kid. I was the one getting bullied, getting mocked, getting pushed around. He smiled sadly. I deserved every bit of it, honestly. I was reaping what I'd sown. That must have been terrible. It was, but it saved me. And you know what else saved me? A teacher named Mrs. Chen. She saw something in me, saw past the awful kid I'd been, and she sponsored me. Paid for after-school programs, bought me books, made sure I had what I needed to succeed. But she didn't do it blindly. She made me work for it. She made me apologize to every kid I'd ever bullied. She made me volunteer at a food bank. She made me understand that her help was a gift, not a right. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Ms. Torres, what you're doing isn't revenge. It's rescue. You're trying to save that boy from becoming someone he'll hate when he grows up and realizes what he's done. You're trying to save him from the path I was on. Tears welled in my eyes. Thank you. I needed to hear that. I'll keep this letter safe, he promised, tucking it into his desk drawer. And when the time is right, when I think he's ready to truly hear what you're saying, I'll give it to him. I left his office feeling lighter, more certain that I'd made the right choice. Whatever happened next, I'd done what I could. The rest was up to Angela, up to my mother, and ultimately up to Ethan himself. Monday came the first day of Ethan's suspension. I learned about it later, pieced together from different sources, but the picture was clear enough. Angela had to stay home from work, unable to afford a sitter on her tight budget. Ethan had woken up confused, asking why he wasn't going to school. When Angela tried to explain that he was suspended, that he'd been bad, Ethan had started crying. Not the manipulative tears of a child trying to get his way, but real, frightened sobs. But I didn't mean to, he'd said over and over. I was just playing. Mommy, you said it was okay. You said he was being too sensitive. Angela, according to what I heard, had tried to comfort him, but she couldn't. Because how do you comfort a child when you're the one who taught him the behaviour that got him in trouble? By mid-morning, Ethan's crying had shifted into a different question, one that hit Angela like a physical blow. Why doesn't Aunt Becky love me anymore? Angela had frozen. She'd opened her mouth to give her standard answer, to tell him, I was cruel, I was selfish, I was punishing him for no reason. But looking at her son's tear-streaked face, the words wouldn't come. She does love you, honey. Then why did she stop paying for my school? Why doesn't she come to see me anymore? Did I do something wrong? Angela hadn't been able to answer. She'd just held him while he cried, and something inside her had cracked. That night, according to Jennifer, who Angela had called in a moment of weakness, Angela lay awake in bed long after Ethan had cried himself to sleep. The house was quiet, dark, and in that darkness a question kept circling through her mind, one she'd spent 35 years avoiding. Am I the problem? I didn't hear from Angela for nearly 2 weeks after that first day of Ethan's suspension. The silence was telling. I went about my life teaching my classes, grading papers, having dinner with colleagues who actually appreciated my company. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the next crisis call, the next emergency that would require me to drop everything and rescue someone who'd never say thank you. But I heard things. Through Jennifer, through Sarah, through the strange network of acquaintances that exists in every small community, I heard about Angela's world falling apart piece by piece. The first domino fell at her job. The dental office where she'd been working as a receptionist for the past 18 months was downsizing. They needed to cut staff, and when it came down to choosing who to let go, Angela was the obvious choice. She had been late 43 times in a year and a half. She'd called in sick at least once a week. She'd been caught on her phone during work hours more times than her manager could count. While other receptionists had learned the billing software and taken on additional responsibilities, Angela had done the bare minimum, complaining that they didn't pay her enough to do extra work. So when the cuts came, she was the first to go. Jennifer told me Angela had been shocked, absolutely blindsided, insisting it was discrimination that they were targeting single mothers. But everyone knew the truth. She'd simply never been good at her job, and now there were consequences. The second domino fell when Angela reached out to her ex-husband, Ethan's father, Marcus Sr. They'd divorced when Ethan was 2, and Marcus paid child support reliably every month. $750 mandated by the court. Angela had tried multiple times over the years to get him to pay more, always with some sob story about unexpected expenses. Usually, he'd cave and send an extra couple hundred here and there. Not this time. According to Jennifer, who'd heard it from someone who'd heard it from Marcus's current wife, Angela had called him begging for help with Ethan's tuition. She'd spun her usual tale about being a struggling single mother, about sacrificing everything for their son, about how she just needed him to step up and help her out. Marcus had apparently listened in silence, then said 5 words that ended the conversation. "You spent it on designer bags?" He'd been paying attention all these years, watching her social media posts, seeing the expensive brunches and the shopping hauls and the weekend trips. He'd been documenting it, his wife told Jennifer, in case Angela ever tried to go back to court for more money. He knew exactly where his child support was going, and it wasn't all going to Ethan. "I send you $9,000 a year," he'd told her. "That's on top of providing his health insurance and paying for his summer camp. If you can't afford his school, it's because you're spending money on yourself instead of your child. Don't call me again unless it's about Ethan's actual needs." The third domino was perhaps the most painful. The parent community at Centennial Academy was small and tightly knit, and word had spread about the tuition situation. At first, the gossip had been sympathetic toward Angela. Poor single mother struggling to make ends meet sister who cruelly withdrew support. But then Sarah, who apparently had a longer memory than anyone gave her credit for, had mentioned something at a book club meeting. "Didn't Angela borrow money from Rebecca years ago for a nail salon? Whatever happened with that?" The question had hung in the air. Then someone else remembered the Cancun photos from 5 years ago. Someone else remembered Angela bragging about her vacation, about the all-inclusive resort. The timeline matched perfectly with when she was supposedly opening her business. The story spread like wildfire. Rebecca had loaned her sister $20,000. Angela had gone on vacation instead. The nail salon never existed, and Rebecca had never been repaid. Suddenly, Angela wasn't the victim anymore. She was the con artist, the user, the liar who'd been playing everyone for fools. Then came the offer that must have felt like salt in an open wound. Mrs. Patricia Drummond, whose family had made their fortune in real estate, approached Angela at school pickup one day. Patricia's daughter was in Ethan's class, and Patricia had apparently decided she wanted to help. She would pay the remaining tuition for the semester, all $12,500, ensuring Ethan could return to school after his suspension. There was just one condition. Angela had to stand up at the next parent association meeting and publicly apologize. Apologize for lying about paying tuition herself. Apologize for taking credit for Rebecca's generosity. Apologize for the example she had been setting for her son. Jennifer told me Angela had gone white when Patricia made the offer. "Think about it," Patricia had said kindly but firmly. "Your pride or your son's education, your choice." That was 3 days ago. Tonight, my phone rang at 10:30. I was already in bed reading when I saw Angela's name on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. I didn't say hello. I just waited. "Rebecca," her voice was barely a whisper, thick with tears. "Rebecca, please. I need help. I don't know what to do. I lost my job, and Marcus won't help, and everyone knows about the money and about Cancun, and I can't afford rent next month. And Ethan keeps asking when he can go back to school, and I just..." She broke down, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her next words. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll pay you back. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever you want. Just please help me." I sat up in bed, my book forgotten, listening to my sister cry. Part of me wanted to feel victorious. This was karma, wasn't it? This was justice. She'd spent 35 years using people, lying to people, taking from people, and now she was finally facing consequences. But all I felt was tired. I listened to Angela cry for a full minute before I spoke. "There's a parent meeting Thursday night, 7 o'clock. Principal Harrison told me about it when I met with him. They're discussing Ethan's behavioural issues and the conditions for his return to school." "I know," she sobbed. "I got the notice 2 weeks ago. Rebecca, I can't go. Everyone's going to be there. Everyone knows everything now. They're going to humiliate me." "Then don't go," I said simply, Let Ethan transfer to public school. It's not the end of the world. But he loves Centennial, and Mrs. Drummond said she'd pay if I just apologize, if I just stand up and tell the truth. Then do that. I can't stand in front of all those people and admit what I did. Rebecca, please, can't you just come back? Can't you just start paying again and make this all go away? And there it was. Even now, even after everything she wanted me to fix it, she wanted me to rescue her from the consequences of her own choices. She wanted me to make it easy. No, Angela, I can't make this go away. This is your mess. You have to clean it up. I hate you, she whispered and hung up. I sat in the darkness of my bedroom, my phone still in my hand, and wondered if I was doing the right thing. But deep down, I knew I was. Sometimes love means letting people fall. Thursday evening arrived, cold and grey. I hadn't planned to attend the parent meeting. It wasn't my place anymore, and frankly, I wanted no part of the public spectacle it would inevitably become. But at 6:30, Principal Harrison called me. Ms. Torres, I know this is asking a lot, but would you consider coming tonight? I think it would help to have you here. Angela needs to see that this isn't about cruelty. It's about truth. Something in his voice made me agree. I changed into a simple black dress, pulled my hair back, and drove to the school with my stomach in knots. The meeting room was packed when I arrived. 20, maybe 25 parents all sitting in a circle of folding chairs. I recognized Patricia Drummond immediately, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. Jennifer gave me a small, encouraging nod from across the room. And there, in the back corner near the door, looking uncomfortable and out of place, was my mother. Our eyes met. She looked away first. Angela sat in the front row, her shoulders hunched, her face blotchy from crying. She didn't see me come in. Principal Harrison stood at the front of the room with a laptop connected to a projector screen. Thank you all for coming, he began. We're here tonight to discuss a situation that affects our entire school community. It's about honesty, accountability, and the values we want to teach our children. He clicked his laptop and the projector screen lit up. This is a timeline of tuition payments for Ethan Torres over the past 2 years. The screen showed a series of emails and payment confirmations, each one clearly marked with my name as the donor. September 2023, January 2024, May 2024, September 2024, each payment $12,500, all from Rebecca Torres. The room was silent except for the sound of someone shifting in their chair. For 2 years, Principal Harrison continued. Ms. Rebecca Torres anonymously funded her nephew's education. The family was unaware of her generosity. When Ms. Torres chose to discontinue her voluntary donation, the truth came to light. A parent I didn't recognize raised her hand. So Angela wasn't paying at all. She let us all think she was making huge sacrifices for her son's education, but it was her sister the whole time. That's correct, Principal Harrison said quietly. Another parent stood up, her face flushed with anger. I recognized her as one of Angela's book club friends. Angela, you told us last year that you were self-made. You said you were working overtime to afford this school. You made me feel guilty for complaining about tuition costs because you made it look so easy. You lied to all of us. Angela's head dropped into her hands. Her shoulders shook. You borrowed $50 from me, another parent called out. Said you were short on groceries because all your money went to Ethan's education. I felt terrible for you, but it was all a lie, wasn't it? The room erupted in murmurs. Parents were turning to each other, sharing stories, connecting dots. The web of Angela's lies was unraveling in real time, and I could see her shrinking smaller and smaller in her chair. Then she did something I never expected. She slid out of her chair and onto her knees on the floor, sobbing. I'm sorry, she choked out. I'm so sorry. You're all right. I lied. I lied about everything. I'm a terrible person and a terrible mother, and I don't deserve any of this. The room went silent. Parents looked away, uncomfortable. This was too raw, too real. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. I stood up. Every eye in the room turned to me as I walked to the front. I knelt down beside Angela and put my hand on her shoulder. "Stand up, Angela." She looked at me through tears, confused. "Stand up," I repeated gently. "You're still my sister." I helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed. She grabbed onto my arm like a lifeline, her whole body trembling. I turned to face the room full of parents, many of whom were watching with expressions ranging from sympathy to judgment. "I didn't do this to humiliate her," I said, my voice carrying in the silent room. "I did it to wake her up. My nephew is 7 years old, and he's already learning to treat people the way his mother treated me. He's already learning that money and status make him better than other children. He's already learning that actions don't have consequences. Ethan is becoming Angela, and Angela is becoming our mother." I glanced at Mum in the corner. She was frozen, tears streaming down her face. "This stops now, not because I'm cruel, but because I love them enough to let them face the truth. Sometimes that's the only way people can change." The room remained silent. Then Patricia Drummond stood up. "I'll honour my offer," she said, looking at Angela. "The apology has been made. I'll pay this semester's tuition. But, Mrs. Torres, I hope you understand that this is a gift, not a right. What you do with this second chance is up to you." Angela nodded, unable to speak. As the meeting ended and parents filed out, my mother finally approached me. She looked older, somehow, smaller. She reached for my hand. "Rebecca, She stopped, searching for words. "I never saw you. Not really. I see you now." I looked at my mother, at the woman who'd raised me to be convenient, who'd chosen Angela over me 1,000 times, who'd laughed when her grandson struck me. And I saw for the first time not a villain, but a broken woman who had made terrible choices and was finally understanding the cost. "I know, Mum," I said softly. "I know. Now." I watched my mother leave the meeting room, her shoulders slumped in a way I'd never seen before. She didn't look back. She just walked out into the cold November night, and I let her go. Angela left shortly after, escorted by Jennifer, who'd offered to drive her home. Principal Harrison thanked me for coming, his handshake warm and firm, and then I was alone in the parking lot, sitting in my car, trying to process what had just happened. I didn't hear from my mother that night, or the next day, or the day after that. But Jennifer, who seemed to have become my unexpected ally and informant, in all of this told me what happened after Mum left the school. She'd heard it from her neighbour, who lived next door to my mother, and had noticed something unusual. "Mum had driven home in complete silence," Jennifer said. "No radio, no phone calls, just the sound of her car engine and her own thoughts. She'd pulled into her driveway, turned off the ignition, and sat there for 20 minutes before finally going inside. The neighbour had been taking out the trash and had noticed Mum's car in the driveway, with the interior light on Mum just sitting there staring straight ahead. Once inside, Mum had walked directly to the kitchen, turned on the single light above the table and sat down. She hadn't turned on the television, hadn't made dinner, hadn't done any of her usual evening routines. She'd just sat there in that kitchen where we'd had 1,000 family meals, where she'd laughed when Ethan slapped me, and she'd stayed there for 3 hours. At some point during those 3 hours, she'd gotten up and retrieved the old photo albums from the hallway closet. Jennifer's neighbour had seen the light stay on in the kitchen until nearly midnight, and the next morning, when they chatted over the fence, Mum had looked like she hadn't slept at all. I learned later, much later, what my mother had seen when she opened those albums. She told me herself during one of our careful tentative conversations months down the road. But even before she told me I could imagine it, I'd looked through those same albums countless times over the years. Every family Christmas photo, Angela front and centre, Mum's arm around her shoulders and me off to the side or cut off at the edge of the frame. Every birthday party, Angela blowing out candles, while I stood in the background holding the cake Mum had asked me to bake. Every graduation, every celebration, every milestone, Angela in focus, Rebecca out of frame or behind the camera entirely, because someone needed to take the picture and I'd always volunteered. Mum told me later that she'd found a photo from my college graduation. I was standing alone in my cap and gown, smiling dutifully at the camera. Angela was visible in the background on her phone board. Mum wasn't in the photo at all because she'd been helping Angela deal with some forgotten crisis. A stranger had taken my graduation photo. The next album showed Angela's baby shower when she was pregnant with Ethan. Page after page of Angela opening gifts, Angela laughing with friends, Angela looking radiant and celebrated. Mum appeared in several photos beaming with pride. I appeared in exactly 2-1, where I was carrying in a tray of food I'd prepared, and another where I was cleaning up wrapping paper in the background while everyone else ate cake. My mother sat at that kitchen table turning pages, and for the first time in her 62 years, she actually saw the pattern. She saw who had always been there and who had always been invisible. She saw who had given and who had taken. She saw the truth she'd spent decades avoiding. At some point, she'd gotten up to put the albums away and had noticed a cardboard box on the top shelf of the closet, pushed far back. She'd pulled it down, opened it, and found things I'd left behind over the years when I'd moved out. Old textbooks, some awards from high school, a few framed certificates, and, at the bottom, a journal with a purple cover that I'd kept during my early 20s. Mum had opened it, knowing she shouldn't, knowing it was a violation of privacy. But she'd opened it anyway, and she'd flipped through pages of my neat handwriting, my thoughts and feelings. From a decade ago, things I'd never said out loud because no one had ever asked. Most of it was mundane. Thoughts about lesson plans, worries about student loans, hopes for the future. But there was one entry dated 3 months after I'd given up my graduate programme to pay Mum's hospital bills. Jennifer said Mum had read it out loud to her weeks later, her voice breaking. Mum told me today that she's so grateful to have daughters who love her. She hugged Angela and told her she didn't know what she'd do without her support during this difficult time. I was standing right there. I was the one who paid the bills. I was the one who took care of everything. But she thanked Angela. I'm starting to understand something. I think Mum sees me as a rock. Solid, dependable, always there. But rocks don't get flowers. They don't get gratitude. They don't get noticed. They just hold things up until they crack. I'm starting to feel the cracks. My mother had closed the journal and sat with it in her lap for a long time. Then she'd picked up her phone, pulled up my number, and stared at it. Her thumb had hovered over the call button. She'd wanted to call me to say something, to apologise, to explain, to beg forgiveness. But what words existed for 33 years of blindness? What apology could possibly be enough? She'd put the phone down without calling. She'd sat there in her kitchen with my old journal in her hands, surrounded by photo albums that told the story of her failure as a mother, and she'd finally felt it. Not anger, not defensiveness, not the urge to explain or justify, just shame, pure, crushing shame. For the first time in her life, my mother was truly ashamed of who she'd been. A week passed with no word from my mother. I'd expected her to call after the meeting to make excuses, or try to explain herself the way she always did. But the silence stretched on, and I found myself in unfamiliar territory. I'd spent so much of my life waiting for my mother's approval, her acknowledgement, her love. Now that I'd stopped waiting, I didn't know what to do with the empty space it left behind. I was grading papers on a Tuesday afternoon when Jennifer called with news that made me stop mid-sentence, red pen hovering over a student's essay. "Your mum went to Myers Jewellery downtown yesterday," Jennifer said, her voice careful. "My cousin works there. She said your mum came in with a ring and asked how much they'd give her for it." My chest tightened. What kind of ring? A wedding ring, gold band with small diamonds. Your cousin said it was vintage, probably 40 years old. Beautiful piece. Your mum seemed really emotional about it, kept touching it like she was saying goodbye. She sold it for $1,800. I closed my eyes. That ring had been my father's last gift to my mother, given on their 20th anniversary just months before he died. It was the only piece of jewellery she'd never taken off. I'd seen her twist it on her finger 1,000 times when she was nervous or deep in thought. It was more than a ring. It was her last physical connection to him. Did she say why she was selling it? She told my cousin she needed the money for something important, something she should have taken care of a long time ago. 2 days later, I learned where that money went. Principal Harrison called me during my lunch break. "Ms. Torres, I thought you should know. Your mother came to the school this morning. She paid a partial tuition payment for Ethan, $1,800. She said it was all she had, but she wanted to contribute something real, not just talk about it." I sat down heavily in my desk chair, my sandwich forgotten. She sold her wedding ring. I suspected it might be something like that. She seemed very emotional. She cried when she wrote the check. He paused. "Ms. Torres, I told her the same thing I'm going to tell you. This is a start. It's a meaningful gesture. But Ethan needs more than money." "What did she say?" "She asked me what he needs. So I told her the truth. I told her that Ethan needs to see the women in his life treat each other with respect. He needs to see his mother and grandmother and aunt speaking kindly to one another. He needs to see that love doesn't mean enabling bad behaviour. He needs role models who show him what healthy relationships look like." How did she respond? She nodded. She didn't argue or make excuses. She just nodded and said, "I understand." Then she asked me if it was too late, if he could still be saved. His voice softened. I told her it's never too late, but it requires real change, not just good intentions. That evening, according to what Mum told me months later, she'd gone home and stood in front of her bathroom mirror for nearly an hour. She'd practiced saying the words out loud. "Rebecca, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything." But they felt hollow, inadequate. How do you apologise for 33 years of neglect? How do you put into words the regret of realising you've broken something precious? She'd given up on speaking the words and had instead written them down in a spiral notebook, the kind she used for grocery lists. She'd filled 3 pages, her handwriting growing messier as she wrote faster, trying to get it all out. All the regrets, all the moments she'd chosen wrong, all the times she'd been blind. When she finished, she'd torn the pages out, carefully folded them, and put them in an envelope along with a photograph. The photograph was from my 8th grade science fair, one I'd never seen before. I was standing next to my project on photosynthesis, holding a second-place ribbon, smiling so wide my eyes were almost closed. Dad was next to me, his arm around my shoulders, looking at me with such obvious pride. Mum had found it at the bottom of a drawer, forgotten for 20 years. On the back, she'd written in fresh ink, "I see you now. Rebecca, I'm sorry it took me so long." She'd driven to my apartment that evening just after sunset. I'd been home curled up on my couch with a cup of tea, half watching a cooking show. I hadn't heard her car pull up or her footsteps on the stairs. I only noticed movement outside my window and glanced over just in time to see her there. She was standing at my door, the envelope in her hands. She raised her hand to knock, then lowered it. Raised it again, lowered it. She looked so small, standing there, so uncertain. This woman, who'd always been so sure of herself, so confident in her judgments, was trembling. Then she knelt down and slid the envelope under my door. She stood up slowly like her knees hurt and placed her palm flat against my door for just a moment. Then she turned and walked away. I sat frozen on my couch watching through the window as she got into her car. I saw her sit there for a moment, her head bowed, her hands gripping the steering wheel. Then she drove away. Only after her taillights disappeared did I move. I walked to my door and picked up the envelope, my hands shaking. I could see my name written on the front in my mother's familiar handwriting, and suddenly I couldn't see anything else because tears were blurring my vision, streaming down my face. I held that envelope and cried for the daughter I'd been the one who'd been invisible for so long. I cried for the mother who'd finally opened her eyes. I cried for all the years we'd lost, all the hurt we'd caused each other through silence and blindness and misplaced priorities. But I didn't open the envelope. Not yet. I wasn't ready. For 3 days, that envelope sat on my kitchen table untouched. I walked past it dozens of times, made my morning coffee while it sat there, ate my dinner with it in my peripheral vision. Each time I felt its presence like a weight, a question that demanded an answer I wasn't sure I wanted to give. I was afraid, I realised. Afraid that whatever was inside would be insufficient, another round of excuses and justifications that would force me to harden my heart all over again. Or worse, afraid that it would be genuine and I'd have to decide whether I was capable of forgiveness. Both possibilities terrified me equally. On the third night, a Friday, I came home exhausted from a long week of parent-teacher conferences. My feet ached. My voice was hoarse from talking all day. I made myself a simple dinner of soup and bread, poured a glass of wine, and sat down at that kitchen table with the envelope directly in front of me. It was time. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of the pages inside. My name on the front written in my mother's hand, slightly shaky. I slid my finger under the flap and opened it carefully, as if whatever was inside might shatter if I moved too quickly. 3 handwritten pages fell out along with a photograph. I picked up the photo first and caught my breath. It was me at 13, standing next to my science fair project, Dad's arm around my shoulders, both of us grinning. I'd never seen this picture before. I looked so young, so happy, so full of hope about the future. I set it aside gently and unfolded the pages. My mother's handwriting filled every line, no margins, words, sometimes running together like she'd been writing too fast to be neat. I began to read. Rebecca, I don't know how to write this. I've started over 6 times. But I'm going to try to tell you the truth, even though the truth makes me ashamed of who I've been. I saw you at that meeting, really saw you. Not as my convenient daughter, not as the responsible one, not as the backup plan. I saw you as a woman who is stronger and braver than I ever was. And I realised something that broke my heart. You're not strong because I raised you well. You're strong because I failed you and you had to raise yourself. My hand started shaking. I kept reading. I've spent the last week looking through old photos, and I finally see what I've done. You were always there, always giving, always sacrificing, and I never once acknowledged it. Worse than that, I gave Angela credit for things you did. I can make excuses. I can say that Angela was loud and needed more attention, that you seemed so capable you didn't need my help. But those would be lies. The truth is simpler and uglier than that. I took the easy path. I praised Angela because she demanded it, and I ignored you because you didn't complain. I had to stop reading for a moment to wipe my eyes. I found your journal, the purple one from when you were 23. I know I shouldn't have read it, but I did, and I read the part about rocks not getting flowers. Rebecca, you were right. I treated you like a foundation, something that would always be there, never needing maintenance or care or gratitude. I took and took and took, and I told myself it was fine because you were strong enough to handle it. The next paragraph was written in darker ink, pressed harder into the paper like she'd been crying while she wrote it. But you weren't strong because you didn't need love. You were strong because no one loved you right. You were strong because you had to be, because I failed to protect you, to see you, to choose you even once. And that's not strength I should be proud of. That's strength I should be ashamed of, because I'm the one who made it necessary. I pressed the letter to my chest, unable to continue for a moment. This was what I'd needed to hear for 33 years. Not excuses, not justifications. Just the simple acknowledgement that she'd seen what she'd done and understood the cost. I forced myself to keep reading. I sold Dad's ring. I know you'd recognise it if I told you. It was the last thing I had of him, and it felt right to give it up. You gave up your education for me. You gave up your savings. You gave up so much of yourself. The least I could do was give up something that mattered to me. I know $1,800 doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't come close to what you've lost because of my blindness, but it was all I had to give that meant something. The final paragraph was the shortest. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to call or visit or let me back into your life. I just needed you to know that I finally see you, Rebecca. And what I see is a woman I don't deserve to call my daughter, but who I'm so deeply proud of I can barely breathe. I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry. Mum. I sat at that table and cried. Not the angry tears I'd shed before, not the frustrated tears of someone who felt invisible. These were different. These were the tears of someone who'd been carrying a weight for so long, she'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. My mother had finally seen me. After all these years, she'd finally understood. I didn't know if I could forgive her yet. I didn't know if our relationship could ever be repaired. But for the first time, I felt like maybe it was possible. Maybe we could find our way back to something real. I was still sitting there, the letter in my hands and tears on my face when my phone rang. I looked at the screen through her blurry eyes and saw Angela's name. I stared at it for a full 10 seconds, watching it ring, trying to decide if I had the emotional capacity for another confrontation tonight. But something made me answer. Hello, Angela? There was a pause, then her voice came through small and trembling in a way I'd never heard before. Rebecca, I know you probably don't want to talk to me. I know I don't deserve it. But can I come over? Please, I need to tell you something I've never admitted to anyone. Not to Mum, not to my friends, not even to myself. And I think if I don't say it now, I never will. I looked at my mother's letter, still spread on the table, at the photograph of my younger self, smiling with such innocence, and I felt something shift in my chest. Maybe it was time to stop running from these conversations. Maybe it was time to finally hear the truth, however painful it might be. Come over, I said quietly and hung up. She arrived 20 minutes later. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, slower than usual, hesitant. When I opened the door, I barely recognised her. Angela had always been meticulous about her appearance, always perfectly made-up hairstyled outfit coordinated. The woman standing in my doorway looked like she'd aged 5 years in the past month. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her face was bare of makeup, revealing dark circles under her eyes and a complexion blotchy from crying. She wore sweatpants and an old college hoodie I remembered from 15 years ago. "Thank you for letting me come," she said, her voice hoarse. "I wasn't sure you would." I stepped aside to let her in. She walked to my living room and sat on the edge of my couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her whole body tense like she might bolt at any moment. I sat across from her in my armchair and waited. "I don't know where to start," she began, then stopped. Her eyes landed on my mother's letter, still on the kitchen table, the photograph visible. "Mum wrote to you?" "She did." Angela nodded slowly. "She's been different since the meeting. Quieter. She sold her wedding ring. Did you know that?" I heard. "She cried for 2 hours after she came home from the jewellery store. I went to check on her and found her just sitting in Dad's old chair holding the receipt, sobbing." Angela looked down at her hands. "I asked her why she did it, and she said it was because she finally understood what sacrifice actually means. That it's not about giving away things you don't need. It's about giving up something that matters." Silence filled the space between us. I could hear the clock ticking on my wall, the muffled sound of traffic outside. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something, and I need you to just listen, because if you interrupt me, I'll lose my nerve." She took a shaky breath. "I've hated you for most of my life, and I need you to understand why." The words should have hurt, but they didn't. I'd known it, felt it, lived with it for years. Hearing her finally admit it out loud was almost a relief. When we were kids, everyone always compared us. Teachers, relatives, mum's friends, they'd say things like, "Oh, Angela is so pretty, but Rebecca is so smart," or "Angela is popular, but Rebecca is going places." And at first, I told myself that being pretty and popular was better, that I'd won somehow. She laughed bitterly. But deep down, I always knew. I always knew you were better than me. Smarter, kinder, more capable. And instead of trying to catch up, instead of working to become someone I could be proud of, I just tried to pull you down. Angela. Please, let me finish. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Do you remember Jason Matthews from high school? I searched my memory. Vaguely, wasn't he in your grade? He was in my English class junior year. I had the biggest crush on him. I thought he was perfect. I changed my schedule to have lunch at the same time as him. I joined clubs he was in. I did everything I could to get his attention. Her voice cracked. And then, one day at a football game, I finally got the courage to talk to him. We were having this great conversation, and I thought maybe he liked me too. Then you walked by with your debate team friends. You didn't even notice us. You were too busy laughing about something being yourself. And Jason stopped at mid-sentence, watched you walk by, and said to me, "Is that your sister, Rebecca Torres? She's amazing. She destroyed the other team at last week's debate tournament." I had no memory of this moment, but I could see from Angela's face that she remembered every detail. In that moment, I stopped seeing you as my little sister. I started seeing you as my enemy, my competition, the person who had everything I wanted without even trying. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face. And from that day on, every time someone praised you, every time you succeeded at something, every time Mum mentioned you, I felt this rage inside me, this burning, consuming jealousy. So I did everything I could to make myself feel superior. I put you down. I took credit for things you did. I made sure Mum paid more attention to me. I told myself you didn't need it, that you were fine on your own. But that was a lie. The truth is, I couldn't stand the thought of you being happy. She doubled over, sobbing into her hands. I'm so sorry, Rebecca. I'm so sorry for being the kind of person who would hurt her own sister out of jealousy. I'm sorry for teaching my son to treat you the same way I did. I'm sorry for taking your money and your time and your love and giving you nothing but cruelty in return. I sat there watching my sister break apart in front of me, and I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction at seeing her suffer. Not vindication that I'd been right about her all along. Just an overwhelming sadness for both of us. For the relationship we could have had. For the years we'd wasted on resentment and competition instead of love. I never wanted to compete with you, Angela, I said softly. I just wanted you to see me. To acknowledge that I existed as more than just a support system for your life. I see you now. God, I see you now. She reached into her purse and pulled out a white envelope, holding it out to me with shaking hands. This is $20,000. The money I borrowed from you 5 years ago. I took out a loan with a terrible interest rate. I'll be paying it off for years. But I needed to give this back to you. I needed to prove that I can actually do something right. I took the envelope, felt its weight, and looked at my sister's face. She looked terrified and hopeful at the same time, like a child waiting to see if she'd be forgiven. I shook my head slowly and held the envelope back out to her. Keep it. What? No, Rebecca, this is your money. Use it for Ethan's therapy. Use it for parenting classes. Use it to become the mother he needs you to be. I pressed the envelope back into her hands. He needs it more than I do. Angela left that night with the envelope clutched to her chest, crying so hard she could barely see to drive. I watched her taillights disappear down the street and felt something like hope stirring in my chest for the first time in months. Maybe people really could change. Maybe it wasn't too late for any of us. 2 months passed. 2 months of Angela working 2 part-time jobs, attending parenting classes twice a week, taking Ethan to a child therapist every Thursday afternoon. I knew all this because she'd started sending me brief text messages updating me on their progress. Nothing dramatic, just simple facts. Ethan's therapist says he's starting to understand consequences. I learned about active listening today. Ethan helped a kid at school who dropped his lunch tray. I didn't respond to most of them, but I read every single one. Then, on a Saturday afternoon in early December, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Angela and Ethan standing on my doorstep. Angela looked nervous, her hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan stared at his shoes, his small hands clasped in front of him. "Hi," Angela said quietly. "I know we should have called first, but Ethan has been asking to see you for weeks and his therapist thought it might be good for him to apologise in person. If you're willing." I looked down at my nephew. He'd grown in the past 2 months, gotten a haircut, and there was something different in his posture, less cocky, more uncertain, more like the little boy I remembered from years ago before the world had taught him all the wrong lessons. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. They entered slowly. Ethan stayed close to his mother, not racing around my apartment the way he used to, not touching everything within reach. Angela guided him to the living room, and they sat on the couch together. I took my usual chair across from them. "Ethan," Angela said gently, "remember what we talked about?" He nodded, but didn't look up. "Can you tell Aunt Rebecca what you want to say?" He took a deep breath, then recited in a flat, rehearsed voice, "I'm sorry for hitting you and being mean." The words were right, but they were empty, mechanical. I could tell he'd been coached, told to say them, but he didn't understand them yet. I stood up and walked over to the couch, then knelt down so I was at his eye level. "Ethan, look at me, please." Slowly, he raised his eyes to meet mine. They were the same brown eyes I'd seen in that surveillance video, but without the cruelty. Now they just looked scared. "Do you know why you're sorry?" I asked softly. He shook his head, and I saw his lower lip begin to tremble. "Do you remember hitting me at Grandma's house?" "Yes," he whispered. "Do you remember what happened after?" "Grandma laughed. Mommy said it was okay." His voice got even quieter. "But then you left and you didn't come back." "That's right. I left because it hurt. Not just my face, though, that did hurt, but it hurt my feelings that no one told you. It was wrong. Do you understand?" A tear rolled down his cheek. "I don't want you to hate me, Aunt Becky." The old nickname, the one he hadn't used in over a year, broke something open inside my chest. I reached out and pulled him into a hug, feeling his small body shake as he started to cry. "I never hated you, sweetheart. Not for 1 second. I was just waiting for you to be kind again. That's all. I was waiting for you to understand that other people have feelings too, and that we have to be gentle with each other." He clung to me, sobbing into my shoulder, and I felt Angela's hand touch my back, briefly a gesture of gratitude she couldn't put into words. When Ethan finally pulled back, his face was red and splotchy, but something had shifted in his expression. Something had been released. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a piece of paper folded in half. "I made this for you," he said, holding it out with both hands. I took it carefully and unfolded it. It was a handmade card, the front decorated with crayon drawings. 2 stick figures, 1 tall and 1 small holding hands. Above them, in his wobbly 7-year-old handwriting, he'd written, "I'm sorry I hit you, I'll be good." Inside, he'd drawn a heart and written, "I love you, Aunt Becky." I stared at that card, at the earnest simplicity of it, at the effort he'd put into every careful letter, and I felt tears sting my eyes. "Thank you, Ethan. This is the best gift anyone's ever given me." He smiled, then really smiled, and for a moment I saw the little boy he used to be before everything got complicated. The little boy who used to hug me tight and tell me I was his favourite aunt. They didn't stay long. Angela said they had to get to Ethan's soccer practice, part of the new routine she'd established, to keep him active and engaged. As I walked them to the door, Ethan turned back and hugged me one more time, quick and fierce. "I really am sorry," he said, and this time I could hear that he meant it. After they left, I closed the door and stood in my entryway still holding that homemade card. I looked at the crayon drawing of two people holding hands at the careful letters spelling out his apology, and I started to cry. Not tears of sadness or anger or vindication. These were different tears. These were the tears of someone who finally understood what all of this had been about. It had never been about revenge. It had never been about making them suffer or teaching them a lesson they'd never forget. It had been about saving a little boy from becoming someone he didn't have to be. It had been about breaking a cycle before it broke him. I walked to my refrigerator and used a magnet to hang Ethan's card in the centre, where I'd see it every day. A reminder that people can change, that love sometimes means saying no, and that the hardest choices are often the ones that save us. Life began to settle into a new rhythm over the following weeks. I returned to my classroom, to my students, to the simple satisfaction of teaching children who wanted to learn. Angela sent weekly updates about Ethan's progress. Mum called occasionally tentative conversations that rarely lasted more than 10 minutes, but felt more genuine than any we'd had in years. I was rebuilding my life piece by careful piece, learning what it felt like to have boundaries that people actually respected. Then, about a month after Ethan's apology, Jennifer called me with unexpected news. "Rebecca, I need to tell you something. Someone in our book club posted about your situation in an online parenting group. She didn't use names, kept everything anonymous, but she shared the basic story. The aunt who stopped enabling her family, who let her nephew face consequences to save him from becoming entitled." My stomach dropped. "Jennifer, I never wanted this to be public." I know, but Rebecca, you need to see what's happening. The post has been shared thousands of times. Thousands. Women from all over the country are commenting, sharing their own stories about family members they've enabled grandchildren. They've spoiled patterns they wish they'd broken. That evening, Jennifer sent me a screenshot of the post. I read it with a strange mixture of discomfort and recognition. The author had captured the essence of what happened without revealing identifying details. She titled it simply, "The Aunt Who Stopped Enabling." The comments section went on for pages. I scrolled through them, reading story after story. A grandmother in Ohio who'd been paying her daughter's rent for 15 years, while the daughter spent money on vacations. A mother in Texas whose son was 42 and had never held a job for more than 6 months because she always bailed him out. An aunt in Michigan whose niece expected her to co-sign loans she knew would never be repaid. But what struck me most were the comments from older women in their 60s and 70s, who wrote with the weight of regret in their words, "I wish I'd done this with my kids. Now they're adults who can't function without my money. My grandson is 25 and doesn't understand why he has to work. I created that. I wish I'd been brave enough to stop." This story made me cry because it's too late for my family, but maybe it's not too late for others. I sat at my computer reading comment after comment, each one a small window into someone else's struggle with the same impossible balance between love and enabling, between helping and hurting. 3 days later, I received an email from a journalist at our local newspaper. The subject line read, "Feature Story Request." I opened it hesitantly. "Dear Ms. Torres, my name is Catherine Mills, and I'm a reporter with the Regional Observer. I've been made aware of your family's story through the viral posts circulating in parenting communities. I understand you value your privacy, and I want to respect that. However, I believe your story could help countless families who are struggling with similar dynamics. Would you be willing to be interviewed for a feature article? We can keep you anonymous if you prefer changing names and identifying details. My goal isn't to sensationalize your experience, but to explore the difficult question of when love requires us to step back rather than step in. Please let me know if you'd be willing to discuss this further." I stared at the email for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it to let this whole thing fade back into privacy, where it belonged. This was my family's story, our pain, our healing. Did it need to be shared with strangers? But then I thought about those comments. Those thousands of women saying, "I wish I'd known this was okay." I wish someone had given me permission to say no. I wish I'd understood that enabling isn't love. I thought about the grandmother whose grandson was 25 and didn't understand work, about the mother whose 42-year-old son couldn't support himself, about all the families trapped in the same cycle we'd been trapped in, thinking they had no choice, thinking that setting boundaries meant they didn't love enough. My finger hovered over the keyboard. I could help them, not by being a hero, not by pretending I had all the answers, but simply by showing them what I'd learned. That sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let people face reality. That boundaries aren't cruelty. That saving someone from consequences isn't the same as saving them from harm. I began typing. Yes, but only if we can make it about breaking patterns, not about me. Catherine Mills responded within an hour, and we scheduled the interview for the following week at a coffee shop halfway between my apartment and the newspaper office. I spent the days leading up to it feeling nervous and second-guessing my decision, but I kept thinking about those comments from women who wished they'd known sooner that setting boundaries was an act of love. The morning of the interview, I called Angela. There's going to be an article, I told her, about what happened with our family. It won't use real names, but I wanted you to know. There was a long pause. Are you going to make me look like a monster? No, I'm going to tell the truth, which is that we were all trapped in patterns we didn't know how to break. That's the whole point. Okay, she said softly. Okay, thank you for telling me. Catherine turned out to be a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanour that immediately put me at ease. She ordered us both coffee and set up a small recording device between us. Before we start, I said, I need you to understand something. My mother and sister aren't villains. They're people who made mistakes just like I have. I don't want this article to be about blame. I want it to be about understanding. I appreciate that, Catherine said, clicking her pen. That's exactly the kind of nuance this story needs. We talked for 2 hours. She asked thoughtful questions about the pattern of enabling in my family, about the moment I decided to stop, about the aftermath. When she asked why I'd done it, I found myself speaking from a place deeper than I'd expected. This isn't about revenge, I said, leaning forward. It never was. It's about breaking cycles before they break children. My nephew was 7 years old and already learning that money and status made him better than others, that hitting people was acceptable, that actions had no consequences. If I'd kept enabling, that I would have been complicit in creating an adult who causes harm without remorse. Catherine nodded, writing quickly. So you see this as an act of love? I do. I love my nephew. That's exactly why I couldn't let him grow up not understanding consequences. The world won't be as forgiving as I was. Better, he learns these lessons now while he's young enough to change than face them as an adult when the stakes are higher. The article was published 2 weeks later. Catherine had titled it, When Love Means Saying No One Woman's Journey to Save Her Nephew. She'd changed our names, altered identifying details, but kept the emotional truth intact. The writing was compassionate and fair, presenting my mother and Angela as complex people rather than caricatures. The quote she'd pulled for the opening summarised everything. I love my nephew. That's why I couldn't let him grow up not understanding consequences. I read the article 3 times, my coffee growing cold beside me, and felt satisfied that we'd done justice to the story. It wasn't sensational. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest. Then I made the mistake of checking my email. Within 24 hours of publication, my inbox exploded. The newspaper had included a contact form for readers who wanted to share their own stories, and apparently, Catherine had forwarded my email address to those who specifically asked to reach me directly. 203 emails. I counted them twice, unable to believe the number. Most were from women between 50 and 70. Mothers, grandmothers, aunts, sisters. Each one sharing a variation of the same story. The adult child who couldn't hold a job, the grandchild being raised without boundaries, the sibling who took and never gave back, the family member whose problems always became everyone else's emergency. I've been paying my son's rent for 12 years, one wrote. He's 38. After reading your article, I told him this month would be the last payment. He hung up on me, but I know it's the right thing to do. My daughter expects me to watch her kids every weekend so she can go out, another said. I'm 72 and exhausted. Your story gave me the courage to say no. But it was one email buried in the middle of the flood that made me stop scrolling. The subject line read, "Thank you. You gave me permission to do what I've been too scared to do for 10 years. I opened it with trembling hands. The email was from a woman in Oregon who'd been supporting her 43-year-old nephew financially for over a decade. She'd just told him she was stopping, and even though he'd threatened to never speak to her again, she felt free for the first time in years. Her final line read, "You showed me that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just fear dressed up as devotion." I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by the weight of all these stories, all these women who'd been waiting for someone to tell them it was okay to stop carrying weights they were never meant to carry alone. I spent the next hour reading through emails, responding to as many as I could, with simple messages of encouragement and solidarity. Then, I came across an email that made me pause for a different reason. The subject line was just a name, Daniel Chen. I clicked it open, my heart beating faster. Daniel Chen. I hadn't heard that name in almost 10 years. Becca. I hope this is actually you and not some bizarre coincidence of names and situations. I read the article in the Regional Observer, and even though they changed the details, I recognised you in every word. The teacher who gives too much, the sister who's too generous, the woman who finally learned to say no. It's been 10 years since college, and I always wondered what happened to you. You were the kindest person I knew back then, and apparently you still are, just wiser now. I always knew you were strong. Would you want to grab coffee sometime? I'd love to catch up. Daniel. I stared at the screen, memories flooding back. Daniel had been in my education cohort in college, one of the few people who'd really understood why I wanted to teach. We'd spent late nights in the library studying together, talking about the kind of teachers we wanted to become. He'd asked me out senior year, and I'd said no because I was too busy working 3 jobs to pay for school and help my family. I'd always wondered what might have been. I typed back, "Yes, coffee sounds good." We met the following Saturday at a small cafe downtown. I recognised him immediately, even though he'd changed. His hair was shorter, touched with grey at the temples. He wore glasses now, but his smile was exactly the same, warm and genuine. "Becca," he said, standing to hug me. "You look exactly the same." "Liar," I said, but I was smiling. "But thank you." We ordered coffee and spent the first 20 minutes catching up on the basics. He taught middle school English for 8 years before moving into educational programming. I told him about my 5th grade classroom, about the students who made every difficult day worthwhile. "I read your article 3 times, he said finally. "It took real courage to share that story." It wasn't supposed to be about courage. It was supposed to be about helping other people avoid the same mistakes. That's what makes it courageous. He leaned forward. "Becca, I need to show you something I've been working on." He pulled out his phone and showed me a website. It's called the Mentor Bridge Program. I started it 2 years ago. We pair students from difficult family situations with adult mentors who can provide stability and support. Not financial support necessarily, but emotional guidance. Someone who can show them what healthy relationships look like. I scrolled through the website, reading testimonials from students whose lives had been changed by having one stable adult who believed in them. "Daniel, this is incredible. It's growing faster than I can manage alone. I have a waiting list of over 100 students and not enough mentors." He looked at me intently. "When I read your article, I thought about how much you understand about toxic family dynamics, about enabling versus helping. You'd be perfect for this. Would you consider co-founding this with me? We could call it the Second Chance Project, expanding it to include not just mentorship, but education for families about healthy boundaries. I looked at him, at this person from my past who'd reappeared at exactly the right moment, offering me something I hadn't even known I needed. A purpose beyond my classroom. A way to turn my painful experience into something that could help countless others. For the first time in months, I felt a genuine smile spread across my face. Not a polite smile, not a careful smile. A real one, the kind that comes from hope. I think, I said slowly, I'd like that very much. For the first time, and I saw a future that was about more than just surviving. A future where I could build something meaningful from the wreckage of the past year. But then, my phone buzzed on the table between us. A text from an unknown number. I glanced at it reflexively, and my smile faded. I read your story. You destroyed my daughter's reputation. We need to talk. Mrs. Torres Sr. My mother. She'd gotten a new phone number, one I didn't recognize. And, apparently, she'd just read the article. Daniel noticed my expression change immediately. Everything okay? I set my phone face down on the table. It will be. My mother just read the article. She's not happy. Do you need to call her back? I thought about it for a moment, then shook my head. No, not right now. Right now, I want to talk about the Second Chance Project. I want to talk about building something good instead of dwelling on what's broken. His smile returned. Then, let's do that. Over the next 2 weeks, Daniel and I met 4 more times sketching out the framework for what would become our scholarship fund. We decided to start small, focusing on students in our local school district who came from families with toxic dynamics. Not just financial need, though, that mattered, but emotional need. Kids who needed someone to show them that their family's dysfunction didn't have to define their future. We set up a non-profit account, filed the paperwork, and created a simple website. Daniel contributed the first $1,000 from his own savings. I matched it. We needed at least $5,000 more to fund our first year, and we weren't sure where it would come from. Then Angela called. Rebecca, I need to tell you something, she said, her voice nervous. I sold my car, the Lexus. I sold it and bought a used Honda instead. The difference was almost $7,000. I used $2,000 to pay down debt, but I want to donate $5,000 to your scholarship fund, if you will accept it. I sat down heavily on my couch, stunned into silence. I know it doesn't make up for what I took from you, she continued quickly. I know $5,000 doesn't come close to the $50,000 you spent on Ethan over the years, but it's what I can do right now. It's my way of showing you that I'm trying to be different, that I want to help instead of always taking. Angela, I said, my voice thick with emotion. Yes, of course we'll accept it, thank you. The donation came through 2 days later, and with it, our fund had enough to support 3 students for a full year. But Angela's contribution had another effect I hadn't anticipated. When word got out that she'd donated, other parents from Centennial Academy started contributing too. Small amounts, mostly $20 here, $50 there, but it added up. Then my mother called, not angry as I'd expected from her text, just quiet. Rebecca, I read the article, all of it, twice, she paused. You were fair to me, fairer than I deserved. And I want to do something to help with this scholarship fund. I can't donate much money, but I was an accountant for 30 years before I retired. I could do your bookkeeping, pro bono, if you'd let me. I looked at Daniel, who was sitting across from me in my living room as we worked on the fund's budget. I put my hand over the phone. My mother wants to volunteer as our bookkeeper. He raised his eyebrows. Can she do it? She was an accountant for 3 decades. Then say yes. And so my mother became part of the project too, showing up every Tuesday evening to organise our finances, track donations, and ensure we stayed compliant with the non-profit regulations. She worked quietly, efficiently, asking for nothing in return. 2 weeks before our official launch event, Ethan appeared at my door with Angela. He was holding a piece of paper. Aunt Becky Mom said your project needs a logo. I made one. He held up his drawing. 2 hands, one slightly larger than the other, clasped together. Above them, in his careful handwriting, the second chance project. The hands were coloured in crayon, shaded carefully to show dimension. For a 7-year-old, it was remarkably thoughtful. Ethan, this is perfect, I said, kneeling down to look at it closely. Can we use this as our official logo? His face lit up. Really? Really? Daniel had the drawing professionally digitised and it became the image on our website, our letterhead, our promotional materials. 2 hands holding each other. Help, given and received. Support that flows both ways. The launch event was held at the community centre on a Saturday afternoon in late January. We'd sent invitations to everyone who donated to local educators, to families we thought might benefit from the programme. I expected maybe 20 people to show up. 50 came. The room was packed with teachers, parents, community members, and even a few of the students we'd already selected for our first round of scholarships. Daniel gave a short speech about the mission of the project. I spoke briefly about why it mattered about breaking cycles and giving kids the tools to build better lives. Then we opened the floor for anyone who wanted to share. An older woman in the back row stood up slowly. She looked to be in her late 60s, elegantly dressed, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. My name is Patricia Hammond, she said, her voice carrying across the room. I'm a retired teacher now, but 40 years ago I was a student from a very difficult home. My parents were neglectful at best, abusive at worst. I was failing school, headed for dropout or worse. But my aunt, my mother's sister, did something similar to what you're doing here. She took me in one summer, showed me what a stable home looked like, paid for tutoring, and told me I was capable of more than I believed. Because of her, I graduated high school. I went to college. I became a teacher myself and spent 35 years helping kids just like I was. Her voice cracked slightly. My aunt passed away 5 years ago, and I've been looking for a way to honour her memory. This project, what you're doing here, it's exactly what she would have wanted. Thank you for keeping that tradition alive. The room erupted in applause. I saw Angela wiping tears from her eyes. My mother's hand was pressed to her heart. Daniel squeezed my shoulder and I felt tears running down my own face. As the applause continued, I noticed movement in the back of the room. A man with a camera on his shoulder, a woman beside him holding a microphone with the logo of our local news station. They'd been there the whole time filming everything. The woman caught my eye and mouthed, "Can we talk after?" I nodded, wondering what I'd just gotten myself into, but also feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. Not the kind that comes from being better than someone else, but the kind that comes from building something meaningful from pain, from turning a personal struggle into something that could help others heal. The news segment aired 2 weeks later, a 5-minute piece during the local evening broadcast. They'd interviewed Daniel and me, shown footage from the launch event, and featured Patricia Hammond's story about her aunt. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Our donation page crashed from traffic. Our email inbox filled with inquiries from people wanting to start similar programs in their communities. The local school district reached out asking if we'd be willing to present our model at their next board meeting. But the most meaningful response came from Principal Harrison at Centennial Academy. "Ms. Torres," he said when he called me at school during my lunch break, "I'd like to host an appreciation ceremony for you and the Second Chance Project, not just for what you've built, but for what you've taught this community about accountability and growth. Would you be willing to speak at our spring assembly?" I hesitated. Public speaking had never been my strength, and the thought of standing in front of hundreds of people made my palms sweat. But then I thought about all the families who'd reached out after the article, all the people who'd said my story gave them courage to make difficult changes. "Yes," I said, "I'll do it." The ceremony was scheduled for a Friday evening in mid-February in Centennial Academy's main auditorium. As I walked into the building that night, I was transported back to 2 years earlier when I'd first toured the school, imagining Ethan thriving in these hallways. So much had changed since then. So much had broken and been slowly, painfully rebuilt. The auditorium was nearly full. Parents, teachers, students, community members. I saw Jennifer and Sarah in the third row. Patricia Hammond sat near the front. Daniel was backstage reviewing his notes for his portion of the presentation. And there in the second row sat my mother Angela and Ethan. Mum wore the navy dress she saved for special occasions. Angela looked nervous but present in a way I'd never seen before. And Ethan sat between them, swinging his legs, clutching something I couldn't quite see. Principal Harrison welcomed everyone and gave a brief overview of the Second Chance project. Then Daniel spoke about the importance of mentorship and breaking cycles of dysfunction. He was eloquent and passionate, and the audience listened intently. Then it was my turn. I walked to the podium, my notes trembling slightly in my hands. I looked out at all those faces and felt a moment of pure panic. What did I have to say that was worth all these people's time? Then I saw my mother's face. She was crying silently, tears streaming down her cheeks, and I knew what to say. 7 months ago, I began, my voice steadier than I felt. My 7-year-old nephew slapped me across the face at a family dinner. My mother laughed and said he was just playing. My sister told me to hit him back if I dared. And I went home that night and made a decision that would change all of our lives. I told the story simply without drama, focusing not on the hurt, but on what came after. The difficult conversations, the consequences, the slow, painful growth. But tonight, I continued, I want to talk about something more important than what I did. I want to talk about what my family did. Because the truth is, I could stop enabling them, but I couldn't make them change. That was their choice. I gestured to the second row. Mum, Angela, would you come up here, please? They looked shocked. Angela glanced at Mum, who nodded slowly. Together, they stood and made their way to the stage, Angela holding Ethan's hand. They stood beside me, uncertain, vulnerable. This is my mother, I said, putting my hand on her shoulder. She spent 60 years believing that love meant protecting her children from consequences. She favoured one daughter because that daughter was louder, needed more, demanded more. And she took the other daughter for granted because that daughter never complained. I looked at her. But when she finally saw what she'd done, she didn't make excuses. She didn't defend herself. She looked in the mirror and changed. She sold her most precious possession to contribute to her grandson's education. She volunteered hundreds of hours to help build this scholarship fund. She learned at 62 years old that it's never too late to become who you should have been. My mother was openly weeping now, but she stood straight, accepting my words with dignity. And this is my sister, Angela. I turned to her. She spent 35 years taking from everyone around her, believing she was entitled to whatever she wanted, teaching her son those same values. But when she finally hit rock bottom, when she had nothing left to take and nowhere left to run, she didn't blame others. She got 2 jobs. She took parenting classes. She put her son in therapy. She sold her car to donate to a cause that had nothing to do with her own benefit. I squeezed Angela's hand. She learned that being a mother means being uncomfortable sometimes. It means saying no to your child when saying yes would be easier. It means being the parent, not the friend. Angela covered her mouth with her freehand tears spilling over. Family isn't perfect, I said to the audience, but it can learn to be better. That's what I've learned through all of this. Change is possible, but only if we're willing to face the truth and do the hard work. Ethan tugged on my sleeve. I looked down at him. I made you something, he whispered. Would you like to give it to me now? He nodded solemnly. I knelt down to his level and he handed me a large piece of construction paper folded in half. I opened it carefully. Inside was a crayon drawing of 4 people standing in a line, all holding hands. I recognized them immediately. Me mum, Angela and Ethan. Above the drawing, in his careful second-grade handwriting, he'd written, "My family, we are learning." Below the drawing, he'd added, "Thank you for not giving up on us, Aunt Becky." I stared at that drawing, at those 4 stick figures holding hands, and I couldn't speak. My throat was too tight, my eyes too blurry with tears. I just pulled Ethan into a hug and held him. When I finally stood up, still holding the drawing, the entire auditorium rose to their feet. The applause started slowly, then built, filling the space until it seemed to shake the walls. People weren't just clapping politely. They were standing, some crying, some smiling, all acknowledging not just what I'd done, but what my family had done. The hard work of change, the courage of facing yourself and choosing differently. The ceremony ended 20 minutes later, but people lingered, talking, sharing their own stories. I stood near the stage, still holding Ethan's drawing, accepting thanks and well wishes from people I'd never met. Then an elderly woman approached me. She must have been in her mid-70s, with white hair and eyes that held decades of sadness. "Ms. Torres," she said quietly, "my daughter hasn't spoken to me in 10 years. I did many of the same things your mother did. I favoured one child over another. I enabled bad behaviour. I took the good one for granted until she finally walked away." Her voice broke. "But after hearing your story tonight, after seeing your mother up there accepting responsibility, I realised something. It's not too late. Maybe she won't forgive me. Maybe we'll never get back what we lost. But I have to try. Thank you for showing me that it's not too late to at least try." She squeezed my hand and walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with fresh tears in my eyes. As I watched her go, I felt someone approach from behind. I turned to see the news producer from earlier, the woman with the microphone. "Ms. Torres, that was incredibly powerful," she said. "We'd like to do a documentary segment. Something longer, more in-depth, showing the full journey of your family's transformation. Would you be interested in participating?" I agreed to the documentary, though, with the caveat that my family would need to consent to their own participation. The producer understood and said they'd be in touch within the month to begin filming. As I drove home that night, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The ceremony had been more emotionally intense than I'd anticipated, but it had also felt like a closing of one chapter and the opening of another. The next 6 months passed in a blur of activity. The Second Chance project grew beyond anything Daniel and I had imagined. We supported 12 students in our first full year, providing not just financial assistance, but mentorship, tutoring, and family counselling when needed. The documentary crew followed us periodically, filming our work, interviewing families, capturing the slow, steady progress of lives being rebuilt. But more than the professional growth, I watched my own family continue to change in ways both large and small. Mum came to my apartment for dinner once a month, now always bringing something she'd cooked, always staying for at least 2 hours. We talked about real things now. Not just surface pleasantries, but actual conversations about our feelings, our regrets, our hopes. She'd started therapy herself, working through her own childhood trauma that had shaped how she parented. She told me once, tears in her eyes, that she was learning it was never too late to become a better person. Angela and I weren't best friends. I'm not sure we'd ever be that close. But we'd developed something more valuable than closeness, honesty. She called me when she was struggling not to ask for money, but to process her feelings. She'd completed her parenting course and had started taking community college classes in the evenings, working toward a degree in early childhood education. "I want to understand kids better," she told me. "I want to be the kind of mother who sees her child clearly, not the mother who creates problems by refusing to see them at all." And Ethan, my sweet, complicated nephew, was making progress too. His therapy was helping. He'd stopped the bullying behaviour entirely, and his teachers reported that he was actually defending kids who were being picked on now. But growth isn't linear, and children don't change overnight. There were still moments when his old patterns would surface, when the entitlement and arrogance his early environment had taught him would flare up. One of those moments came on a Wednesday in late August, almost exactly 1 year after that fateful dinner when he'd slapped me. Angela had called and asked if I could come over, that she needed me to see something. I'd driven to her apartment, a modest 2-bedroom she'd moved into after selling her expensive condo, and let myself in with the key she'd given me. I heard crying before I saw them. Ethan's voice choked with tears and anger coming from the living room. I walked quietly down the hall and stopped in the doorway unseen. Ethan was sitting on the couch, his face red and splotchy, his school backpack thrown on the floor beside him. Angela sat next to him, her posture calm but alert. "They said we're poor now," Ethan was saying, his voice rising. "Tyler said his mum told him we used to be rich, but now we're poor, and that's why I can't go to his birthday party at the country club anymore. He said everyone knows Aunt Becky stopped paying for my school because we're poor." I winced, feeling the familiar guilt rise up, but I stayed in the doorway silent, waiting to see how Angela would handle this. The old Angela would have exploded. She would have called Tyler's mother, demanded an apology, told Ethan that those kids were just jealous, and he was better than them anyway. She would have reinforced all the wrong lessons while pretending to defend her son. But this Angela did something different. She was quiet for a long moment, just sitting beside her crying son. Then she said in a voice that was gentle but firm, "That must have hurt your feelings when Tyler said that." "It did. It's not fair. Why did you tell his mum about Aunt Becky?" "Now everyone knows I didn't tell Tyler's mum, but other people know, and that's okay. Ethan, I need to ask you something important." She turned to face him directly. "What did you do first? Before Tyler said that about us being poor?" Ethan's crying slowed. He looked down at his hands. "Ethan, I don't remember," he mumbled. "I think you do. Mrs. Patterson called me this afternoon. She said there was an incident at recess. She said you were involved. What happened?" His face crumpled. "I didn't mean it." "What didn't you mean?" "Tyler was playing with Marcus. You know, the kid who used to be on scholarship, and Tyler's parents paid for him to join their soccer team because Marcus is really good at soccer, even though his family doesn't have money. And I just..." He stopped, tears flowing again. But these were different tears. These were tears of shame, not anger. "What did you say, baby?" "I told Marcus he should thank Tyler for everything because without Tyler's family, Marcus would be playing in the dirt instead of on a real team. I said Tyler was probably just being nice to him because his mum makes him." Ethan's voice dropped to a whisper. "Marcus started crying. Tyler got really mad at me. He said I was mean, and his mum was right that we're not really rich anymore, and that's why I'm so mean now because we're poor." The room was silent except for Ethan's quiet sobbing. I pressed my hand to my mouth, my heart breaking for Marcus, for Tyler, for Ethan, who was still learning this difficult lesson about cause and effect, about how our words can wound others. Angela took a deep breath. I watched her struggle with it, saw the old impulses rise up, the desire to defend her child, to make excuses, to blame someone else. But then she did something that made me want to cry. She took Ethan's face in both her hands and made him look at her. "Ethan, listen to me carefully. What Tyler said hurt your feelings. I understand that. But he said those things because you hurt Marcus first. You were cruel to a child who's already had a harder life than you can imagine. You tried to make him feel small so you could feel big. But I didn't. Yes, you did. And I know why you did it. You're angry and confused, and you don't understand why our life changed. But hurting other people won't make you feel better. It just makes more hurt in the world." She pulled him close, holding him tight. "Here's what's going to happen. Tomorrow, you're going to apologize to Marcus. A real apology where you look him in the eye and tell him you were wrong and you're sorry. You're going to apologize to Tyler too, and then you're going to think about how you want to be in this world. Do you want to be the kid who makes people cry, or do you want to be the kid who makes people smile?" "I don't want to make people cry," Ethan whispered into her shoulder. "Then don't. It's that simple. It's a choice you make every single day." She held him while he cried, and I watched from the doorway, my own tears silent on my cheeks. This was the moment that mattered more than any ceremony, any article, any public recognition. This was a mother teaching her child the lesson she'd never been taught herself. This was the cycle breaking in real time. I stepped back quietly, not wanting to intrude on their moment, and went to the kitchen to make tea. When Angela finally emerged 15 minutes later, Ethan having gone to his room to do homework, she found me sitting at her small kitchen table. "You saw," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I saw." "Did I do it right? God, Rebecca, it's so hard. Every instinct I have tells me to defend him, to blame someone else to make it easier for him. But I remember what that created. I remember the boy in that surveillance video laughing after he hit someone. I can't let him become that." I stood up and hugged my sister. "You did it exactly right. You're breaking the cycle, Angela. You're teaching him what I wish someone had taught us when we were young." She hugged me back fiercely, and we stood there in her tiny kitchen, two sisters who'd spent most of their lives as enemies, but were slowly, painfully becoming something like friends. That night, after I'd driven home and changed into comfortable clothes, my phone rang. Daniel. "Becca, I have news. Big news. Good news or bad news? Potentially amazing news with a complication. The Reynolds Foundation just approved our grant application. $100,000. I sat down heavily on my couch. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. It's enough to expand the program to 3 more school districts. We could help 40, maybe 50 students next year. But there's a catch. There's always a catch. They want to feature you prominently as the founder in their annual report and on their website. Full name, photo, your story. They said your personal journey is what made the application compelling. They want to show their donors that they're funding programs led by people who understand the issues from lived experience." I was quiet, thinking about what that would mean. My name and face out there. My family story even more public than it already was. No more anonymity, no more pretending this was about anyone but us. "Becca, you still there?" "I'm here. I'm just thinking." "Hush. You don't have to decide right now. We have 2 weeks to respond. But I wanted you to know. This could change everything for the project. We could help so many more families, but only if you're willing to be public about who you are." After we hung up, I sat on my couch for a long time staring at Ethan's drawing on my refrigerator. 4 stick figures holding hands. My family learning. I called Daniel back the next morning and told him yes. I'd accept the Reynolds Foundation grant and everything that came with it. If being public about my identity could help the project reach more families, help more children avoid the path Ethan had been on, then it was worth the discomfort of exposure. Besides, I was tired of hiding, tired of treating my story like something shameful. It wasn't shame, it was growth. The documentary crew had been following our family sporadically for months, but now they intensified their efforts wanting to capture the final pieces before they edited everything together. The producer, a woman named Maria Chen, who had a gentle way of asking difficult questions, scheduled individual interviews with each of us. I was interviewed first, sitting in my classroom after school surrounded by my students' artwork and the comfortable chaos of a space dedicated to learning. Maria asked me to tell the story from the beginning, and I did as honestly as I could. I talked about the slap, about the years of enabling, about the moment I decided to stop. But I also talked about what came after, about the painful growth, about learning that love sometimes looks like letting go. "What do you want people to understand most from your story?" Maria asked toward the end of our session. I thought about it carefully. That setting boundaries isn't selfish, that you can love someone deeply and still refuse to participate in their dysfunction, and that it's never too late to change for any of us. My mother was 62 when she finally saw what she'd done. My sister was 35. My nephew was 7. They all changed because they chose to do the hard work. That's the real story here, not what I did, but what they did. The next interview was with my mother. She'd been nervous for days leading up to it, calling me twice to ask what she should wear, what she should say. I told her to just be honest, to speak from her heart. The crew set up in her living room, the same room where that fateful dinner had taken place over a year ago. I wasn't present for her interview, but Maria shared some of the footage with me later. My mother sat in Dad's old armchair, her hands folded in her lap, looking older and smaller than I remembered, but also somehow more solid, more present. "I spent most of my life thinking I was a good mother," she said to the camera, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I fed my children. I kept them safe. I showed up to their school events. But I didn't see them. Not really. I saw Angela as the one who needed me, so I gave her everything. I saw Rebecca as the one who didn't need me, so I gave her nothing. It took me 60 years to learn that fair doesn't mean treating both children the same. Fair means loving each child the way they need to be loved. It means seeing them as individuals, not just roles in your life. My Rebecca needed to be seen, to be valued, to be chosen sometimes. And I never gave her that. I gave her responsibilities instead of recognition. I gave her burdens instead of love." She paused, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "I can't get back those 60 years. I can't undo the damage I did. But I can be different now. I can show up differently. I can choose differently. And that's what I'm trying to do every single day." Angela's interview was conducted in her apartment, sitting at her small kitchen table. She'd been hesitant about participating at all, worried about how she'd be portrayed, but I'd encouraged her. "This is your chance to show people that change is possible," I told her. "That's more valuable than protecting your image." She wore a simple blue sweater and no makeup, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked tired, but genuine, stripped of all the artifice she'd once hidden behind. "I thought loving my son meant giving him everything he wanted," she said, her voice quiet. "I thought being a good mother meant making sure he never felt pain, never experienced disappointment, never had to struggle. But Rebecca taught me something crucial. Love doesn't mean giving everything. Love means teaching respect, teaching empathy, teaching that actions have consequences. When I was giving Ethan everything, I was actually giving him nothing of value anyway. I was creating a child who would grow into an adult no one could love, not even himself." She talked about the moment she'd realised her parenting was creating a bully, about watching that surveillance footage and seeing her son laugh after hurting someone. "That was my wake-up call," she said. "That was me, reflected in him. All my worst qualities magnified. And I knew I had to change or I'd lose him, not to distance or estrangement, but to the person he was becoming." The interview with Ethan required special arrangements. His father, Marcus Sr., had to give written permission for Ethan to appear on camera. We'd maintained civil communication with Marcus throughout this entire process, and to his credit, he'd supported Angela's efforts to change. He agreed to Ethan's participation with one condition: his face would be blurred to protect his privacy as a minor. Ethan sat on Angela's couch, his voice small but clear. The crew asked him simple questions appropriate for an 8-year-old. "Do you understand why your Aunt Rebecca stopped paying for your school?" He nodded solemnly. "Because I was being mean, and because my mum and grandma weren't teaching me to be nice. Aunt Becky said sometimes you have to stop helping so people can learn. Are you still mad at her for that?" He shook his head. "No, I'm glad now. Because I learnt to be better. My therapist says I'm learning empathy. That means understanding how other people feel." "What do you want to be when you grow up?" "A teacher like Aunt Becky, so I can help kids who are mean learn to be nice instead." The documentary was scheduled to air on a Thursday evening. in early September, exactly 1 year and 1 week after that dinner when Ethan had slapped me. The local station promoted it heavily, and Maria told us they were expecting significant viewership. The Second Chance Project planned a small watch party at the community centre, inviting everyone who'd been involved with the programme. Daniel picked me up at 6:30 and we drove to the community centre together. My mother was already there, having arrived early to help set up. Angela and Ethan came in a few minutes later. We sat together in the front row, the four of us, just like in Ethan's drawing. When the documentary began, the room fell silent. Maria had titled it "Breaking the Cycle: One Family's Journey from Dysfunction to Healing." It opened with footage from the appreciation ceremony, showing Ethan presenting me with his drawing, then pulled back to tell the story chronologically. 20 minutes doesn't sound like a long time, but it felt endless watching our story play out on screen. The raw honesty in my mother's voice, the vulnerability in Angela's admission of her failures, the sweet earnestness of Ethan explaining empathy, and my own words talking about boundaries and love and the courage to let people face consequences. The documentary ended with footage from the Second Chance Project launch event, showing Patricia Hammond's speech about her aunt, showing all the families who'd come together around this idea that change was possible. Maria's closing narration spoke about the ripple effects of one person's decision to stop enabling how it had transformed not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of what love really means. When it ended, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. People hugged us, thanked us, told us how much the story meant to them. I felt overwhelmed and exposed, but also strangely free. The secret was out. Everyone knew now, and instead of judgment, I felt acceptance. The emails started arriving almost immediately. By the next morning, my inbox had over 100 messages. By the end of the week, there were 503. They came from across the country. Mothers in California, grandmothers in Maine, fathers in Texas, aunts in Florida, each one sharing a variation of the same struggle. How do I stop enabling? How do I set boundaries without destroying the relationship? How do I know if I'm helping or hurting? Is it too late to change? I tried to respond to as many as I could, but there were simply too many. Daniel and I discussed creating a resource guide, a collection of the lessons we'd learned, but we weren't sure how to proceed. Then, on the following Tuesday, one email stood out from all the others. The subject line read, "Official inquiry from County School District." I opened it with curiosity and growing excitement. "Dear Ms. Torres, my name is Patricia Sanderson, and I'm the superintendent of the County School District. I watched your documentary with great interest. Your family story, combined with the work you're doing through the Second Chance Project, represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need in our approach to family engagement and student support. We would like to adopt your family story as a case study for our new parenting workshops, which will be offered free to all families in our district. Additionally, we have a proposal we'd like to discuss with you regarding a potential partnership between the Second Chance Project and our district's counselling services. Would you be available to meet with me and our board next week? We believe this could be the beginning of something that could help thousands of families in our community." I read the email 3 times, my heart pounding. This was beyond anything I'd imagined. Not just helping individual families through our small scholarship fund, but potentially influencing how an entire school district approached family dynamics and student well-being. I forwarded the email to Daniel with a single line, "I think we need to talk about scaling up." His response came back within minutes. "My office. Tomorrow morning, bring coffee. This is huge." The partnership with the school district transformed the Second Chance Project from a small local initiative into something with real reach and impact. Over the next 6 months, we developed curriculum materials, trained counsellors, and began offering workshops for parents struggling with the same issues my family had faced. The Reynolds Foundation grant funded our expansion, and suddenly Daniel and I were running an organisation that employed 3 part-time staff members and served families across 5 school districts. But the most meaningful impact continued to be the individual stories. 3 families reached out specifically asking for help, not with money, but with the emotional work of establishing boundaries. A mother whose 28-year-old son lived in her basement and hadn't worked in 4 years. A grandfather who'd been paying his granddaughter's rent while she spent her income on luxuries. An aunt who'd become the default babysitter for her sister's 3 children, sacrificing her own retirement plans. Each of them had watched the documentary and recognized themselves in my story. Each of them wanted to know, how do you start? How do you have that first conversation? How do you hold firm when they push back? We couldn't counsel them directly. We weren't licensed therapists, but we connected them with resources, with support groups, with therapists who specialized in family systems and codependency. And we followed up, checking in months later to see how they were doing. Most reported that it was the hardest thing they'd ever done, but also the most necessary. Relationships were strained, but honest now. The people they'd been enabling were angry, but finally taking responsibility. One letter in particular stayed with me. It came from a 70-year-old grandmother in Ohio named Margaret Brennan. She wrote, "I've been giving my grandson a monthly allowance of $1,500 since he graduated college 8 years ago. He's 30 years old. He told me he was finding himself and needed time to explore his creative passions. After watching your documentary, I realized I wasn't helping him find himself. I was helping him avoid growing up. I called him and told him the allowance would stop at the end of the month. He didn't speak to me for 6 weeks, but last week he called to tell me he got a job. Just a retail position. Nothing fancy, but it's a start. He said, 'Grandma, I was so angry at you, but you were right. I needed to do this myself. Thank you for giving me the courage to love him better.' I kept that letter in my desk drawer and read it whenever I doubted whether any of this mattered. One person at a time, one family at a time, the cycle was breaking. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his own journey. He'd been in therapy for over a year now, and the changes were remarkable. His school counsellor called Angela one afternoon with unexpected news. The 3rd grade teachers wanted to start a buddy mentor program where older students would help 1st graders adjust to school. They'd asked their students who might be good at this, who understood kindness and patience. Ethan's name had come up multiple times. "They're nominating him," Angela had asked, disbelief in her voice. "They're not just nominating him. The 1st graders specifically requested him. Apparently, he helped a new student who was being teased about his accent, and the boy's parents wrote a letter praising Ethan's compassion." Angela had called me, immediately crying. "Rebecca, do you know what this means? A year and a half ago, he was the bully. Now, kids feel safe around him. Now, he's the one teaching kindness. You did that," I'd told her. "You chose to parent differently, and this is the result." "We did that," she'd corrected. "All of us." Ethan took his role as buddy mentor seriously. Once a week, he'd spend his lunch period with a 1st grader named Carlos, who was struggling with anxiety. I volunteered in Ethan's school library occasionally, and I'd seen them together. Once, Ethan patiently teaching Carlos how to check out books, speaking gently, making the smaller boy laugh. It was like watching a different child, or maybe it was watching the child he'd always been meant to be before we taught him all the wrong lessons. Everything felt like it was moving in the right direction. The project was growing, my family was healing, Ethan was thriving, and then Mum started forgetting things. Small things at first. She'd forget that she'd already told me a story and would tell it again word for word an hour later. She'd lose her keys 3 times in 1 week. She'd call me by Angela's name occasionally, then correct herself with an embarrassed laugh. Angela and I exchanged concerned glances, but didn't say anything. She's getting older, we told ourselves. It's normal. But then she forgot a Tuesday evening, the night she always came to my apartment to do the Second Chance Project bookkeeping. I called her at 7:30 when she hadn't shown up. "Oh, honey," she'd said, confusion in her voice. "Was that tonight? I thought that was tomorrow." "Mom, it's always Tuesday. It's been Tuesday for 8 months. Well, I don't know where my head is these days. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She'd shown up 45 minutes later, having gotten lost on streets she'd driven for 30 years. Angela and I took her to the doctor the following week. We sat on either side of her in the neurologist's office, while he explained the results of her cognitive tests and brain scans. Early-stage Alzheimer's disease, he said gently. It's progressing slowly, which is good. But you need to start planning for her care now while she can still participate in decisions about her future. My mother had sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, taking in the diagnosis with a calm that scared me more than tears would have. How long? She asked quietly. That's impossible to predict. Could be 5 years, could be 15. But the early stage where she can still live relatively independently, probably 1 to 2 years. After that, she'll need increasing support. We'd driven home in silence, each of us processing what this meant. That night, Angela and I met at a coffee shop to talk without Mum present. She can't live alone much longer, Angela said, stirring her coffee without drinking it. In 6 months, maybe a year, she's going to need someone there. Someone to make sure she takes her medication, eats properly, doesn't leave the stove on. I know. I can't do it, Rebecca. Her voice broke. I want to. God, I want to be the daughter who steps up and takes care of her, but I'm barely keeping my head above water as it is. 2 jobs, Ethan's therapy bills, my own therapy, trying to finish my degree. I can't afford to quit work to care for her, and I can't afford to hire someone. And my apartment is tiny. There's nowhere for her to stay. I know, I said again because I did know. Angela wasn't making excuses. She was stating facts. She'd come so far in the past 18 months, but she was still rebuilding her life from the ground up. Taking on full-time care of a parent with dementia would break her, and probably Ethan too, which left me. I had the space. My 2-bedroom apartment had a spare room I used as an office. I had the financial stability, my teaching salary, plus the modest stipend I now received from the Second Chance project. I had the flexibility. I could hire home health aides to stay with her during the day while I was at work. But I also had something I'd fought hard to claim over the past 18 months, my own life. My boundaries, my peace. Taking Mum in would mean giving up my privacy, my quiet evenings alone, my carefully constructed independence. It would mean going back to being the caretaker, the one who sacrificed the one everyone depended on. 2 weeks later, we met with Mum's doctor again to discuss care options. He laid them out clearly, moving in with family-assisted living facility or eventually a memory care unit. For now, she could manage in a good assisted living facility, he said. But she'll need family support regardless. Regular visits, help with finances, advocacy with the medical system. This isn't something any of you can do alone. After the appointment, the 3 of us sat in my car in the parking lot. Mum in the passenger seat, Angela in the back. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Angela said, her voice small, I'm so sorry I can't take her. I'm so sorry you have to be the one to figure this out. I looked at my mother, this woman who'd spent 60 years being blind to my needs, who'd finally learned to see me just in time to start losing her mind. I thought about everything that had happened. The slap that started it all, the boundaries I'd set, the family that had broken and slowly, painfully begun to heal. I closed my eyes and heard my father's voice from that hospital room so many years ago. Don't let people mistake your kindness for weakness, but don't let your strength make you cold either. I opened my eyes and looked at both of them. She moves in with me. Angela's breath caught. Rebecca, you don't have to, but we do this together, I continued firmly. All of us. You can't provide housing or full-time care, but you can visit twice a week. You can handle her medical appointments when I can't. You can take her for Sunday dinner. Ethan can read to her, spend time with her. We share this. Not equally, because that's not possible. But we share it. That's the deal. Angela nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes, I can do that. I will do that. I turned to my mother, who'd been silent through all of this. Mum, is this okay? with you living with me, She reached over and took my hand, her grip still strong, even as her mind began to fail. You're giving me a home when I didn't give you the love you needed. Why would you do that? I squeezed her hand. Because you taught me something in the end, even if you didn't mean to. You taught me that it's never too late to change. And I learned that love doesn't mean enabling or sacrificing myself completely. It means showing up with boundaries, with honesty, with my eyes open. I smiled at her. I'm not doing this because I owe you. I'm doing it because I choose to. There's a difference. She nodded slowly, understanding, even through the fog that was beginning to cloud her mind. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for choosing me. Mum moved into my spare bedroom 3 weeks later. Angela helped me convert my office into a comfortable space for her painting, the walls, a soft blue hanging curtains Mum had made years ago. We learned to adapt all of us to this new configuration of family. 6 months after Mum moved in, we had a family dinner at my apartment. It was a Sunday evening in late November, almost exactly 2 years since that dinner when Ethan had slapped me. Now we gathered around my small dining table, Mum, Angela, Ethan, Daniel and me. Mum sat at the head of the table, her memory foggy but her eyes bright with contentment. Angela carved the roast chicken she'd brought, pride evident in her posture. She was finishing her degree this semester, working toward a career helping other families. Ethan, now 9 years old and several inches taller, told us excitedly about his buddy mentoring program. Carlos read a whole book by himself this week, he said, beaming. He was so proud. The dinner wasn't perfect. Ethan got frustrated when Mum asked him 3 times what grade he was in. Grandma, I already told you. Angela immediately intervened. Ethan, we've talked about this. We answer with patience. Ethan's face flushed. I'm sorry, Grandma. I'm in 3rd grade. He apologised, without being forced, just because he understood it was right. I caught Angela's eye and we shared a small smile. Progress. Imperfect, but real. The next morning, I stood before my 5th grade class during our weekly discussion circle. A student named Emma raised her hand. Miss Torres, my mum says I'm too nice. She says people take advantage of me. But isn't being nice good? I thought carefully about my answer. Being kind is one of the most important things you can be, Emma. But kindness doesn't mean saying yes to everything. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is say no. Real kindness sometimes means having difficult conversations. It means setting boundaries. It means letting people face consequences so they can grow. I saw understanding dawn on their young faces. These lessons I'd learned through pain they were learning at 10 years old. That afternoon I found a letter in my desk drawer. Ethan's handwriting careful and deliberate. Dear Aunt Becky, my teacher asked us to write about someone we admire. I wrote about you. When I grow up, I want to be like you. I want to be a teacher who helps kids learn to be kind. I know I wasn't always nice to you. I know I hurt you. But you didn't give up on me. You just taught me a better way. Thank you for that. P.S. I'm really, really sorry I slapped you that night. I'll never do it again. I promise. Love, Ethan. I read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words. Then I carefully placed it in the frame, with his drawing of 4 people are holding hands. I set it on my desk right next to the photograph of my father and me at the science fair. I looked at my father's face and whispered, I did it, Dad. I didn't stay silent. I found the balance you tried to teach me. Outside my classroom window, across the parking lot, I could see the sign above our office. The Second Chance Project, founded by Rebecca Torres. 2 years ago, I'd been invisible. Now, my name was on a building dedicated to helping others. I walked to the back wall of my classroom, my inspiration wall. Over the past year, I displayed letters from families who'd found the courage to change after hearing our story. There were dozens now. Thank you for showing us that boundaries are love. Thank you for for showing us it's never too late to change. Thank you for showing us that our children need consequences more than comfort. Each letter represented a family choosing differently, a cycle broken, a child saved from becoming someone they'd regret. The door opened, Daniel carrying coffee. "Big day tomorrow," he said. "The district board is voting on expanding the programme to all 23 schools." "I know, I'm nervous." "Don't be. What you've built here, it's changing lives." He gestured to the wall of letters. "This is your legacy." "Our legacy," I corrected. "None of us do anything truly meaningful alone." After he left, I stood at my window watching the sunset. I thought about that dinner 2 years ago, about the slap that changed everything, about the revenge I could have taken. Instead, I'd chosen something harder. Boundaries with love, consequences with compassion, truth with patience. And watching my nephew become a boy who taught kindness, watching my sister become a mother who prioritised character, watching my mother spend her final clear years making amends, I understood something profound. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't making them suffer. It's watching them become better and knowing you gave them that chance. If you've made it to the end of Rebecca's story, thank you for being here. Stories like this don't just entertain us, they challenge us to look at our own lives, our own families, and ask ourselves the hard questions. Are we enabling behaviours that hurt the people we love? Are we setting boundaries or silently accepting treatment we don't deserve? Are we teaching the next generation that actions have consequences, or are we teaching them that love means never saying no? Rebecca's journey wasn't about revenge. It was about courage. The courage to stop carrying weight that was never hers to carry. The courage to let people she loved face the truth, even when it hurt. And most importantly, the courage to believe that people can change when given the right motivation. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this story. Have you ever been in Rebecca's position, feeling like the family backbone that nobody acknowledges? Have you had to make the difficult choice to stop helping someone because your help was actually hurting them? Or maybe you've been on the other side realising too late that someone's generosity wasn't limitless. Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think or feel or see your own relationships differently, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that like button and share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Sometimes we all need permission to set boundaries, to say no, to choose ourselves without guilt. And sometimes the best gift we can give someone is letting them grow up. Remember, it's never too late to change. It's never too late to break the cycle. It's never too late to choose love that's honest over love that enables. Thank you for listening to Rebecca's story. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.